How are we doing today? Hello, hello. Let's get started, shall we? Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hello, Zakia is our mod today. We've got Azula, Halia as well here so far. We'll give people another moment or two just to get in as we're starting bang on time today. And we've got a lot to cover. So today we are doing our exam masterclass. This is session 2, and it will be all about Tennessee Williams and A Streetcar Named Desire. So this session is aimed particularly towards year 12s and year 13s who are upcoming either to their mocks for their drama paper or for their actual upcoming exams, which, as we know, are kicking off in the coming weeks. So this can serve you either as an introduction to the text, if, for example, you are looking to do A-level, or if you haven't seen this text before and you're going to be studying it next year as a year 13. I know loads of people do A Streetcar Named Desire later on in their specification. But also, this is a good way to start from the beginning and spend some time reviewing your exam materials, because we're going to be starting from the beginning, from perhaps ideas that if you are using this as a form of revision, you've may not looked at for a while, including the context, the plot, the characters, the themes, etc., and then going all the way through to an essay question, lines of argument, quotations, critics, applications, model paragraphs, related themes, and then a little Q&A at the end. So the first half of our session is going to be reviewing context, ideas of modern tragedy, the plot, of course, characters, key themes, quotations, and critics, and then we'll get into an essay question and spend the second half of our time together on an essay question. So this will be a 3-hour session. The idea is that we follow along the whole time. If you know people that are taking the same exam as you or studying the same text, feel free to send them this link as well so that they can benefit from this knowledge as well. It will also be available on my YouTube channel, Eleanor Does English, in perpetuity, so that you will be able to return to this and review should you need it another time, or your classmates can look at it later if they're otherwise engaged right now. A reminder as well that your workbook is available in the link. So I've made a workbook that has all of the content from this lesson so that you can follow along, annotate with us, jot down notes, and leave with a kind of revision guide to A Streetcar Named Desire there ready for you. And you can use it as you go on in the next couple of weeks with your final push of revision, or as notes for when you need them another time. So if you follow that link in the description, you will be able to access the workbook if you put in your email address, and access also the workbook for our Othello session, which was 2 weeks ago at the same time. So let's get started, shall we, with thinking about A Streetcar Named Desire. But firstly, just to introduce myself, I'm Eleanor. If you haven't joined us before, I'm one of the teachers at my EdSpace. I've been teaching Key Stage 5 for a long time, and then also been offering free streams to Key Stage 5 students on the most common texts studied at A-level, regardless of exam board, across the year from September. So we've covered an entire series on Othello, on Streetcar Named Desire, on The Great Gatsby, and we're currently getting into The Handmaid's Tale. We're also going to be looking at poetry across this year as well. So all of these ideas there for you to learn, to broaden, deepen your knowledge as well. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's start with what you know. So please put your ideas into the chat for what you know about A Streetcar Named Desire. And this will depend on your comfort with the text, but feel free to check your answers, put anything you know here, because then I have a better idea of where we are starting as a group. Okay. So we can get us started with perhaps some of the most common ideas that people know about A Streetcar Named Desire. For example, they know that it's a play written by Tennessee Williams. It's good. Old South versus New South. Good. You can see SH. Yes, good. Old South versus New South. Good. So Tennessee Williams's own repressed sexuality. He was a gay man living in a time in which homosexuality was considered taboo, transgressive, even at points illegal. So yes, thinking about repressed sexuality, because of course, that's also a theme in the play as well. We know that the play is modern. In this case, it was written in the 20th century. And so likely it's going to be different from Shakespeare plays in several ways here. We also might know that it's set in New Orleans, which is in the American South. And that it captures some of these ideas of, clearly even from the title, sex, lust, desire, love, as well as ideas of class, gender, and violence, as we will see. You may know the famous line Stella from the 1951 film version, which was co-produced by Tennessee Williams and was the reason why Marlon Brando became a really, really famous actor. This was his first role, was performing it first in the Broadway version and then in the film version. And we know that in the most famous line of it is when he yells Stella out to his wife. Okay. This is a good way to get us started. Let's look at the introduction to the play now and what we know. This was first performed as a play in 1947. It's also set in 1947, so it will be a play that is trying to capture the current or the contemporary zeitgeist of the American South. So it's a play meant to reflect ideas of the time and capturing ideas of the time. Remember 1947, the Great Depression ended around 1939, and 1947 also 2 years after the end of World War II. So immediately we are locating ourselves in a time period in which these characters, as well as our audience, would have lived through the Great Depression and World War II and have been impacted by the effect that those huge events had on society. And the most famous film version, as I said, the 1951 version, stars Vivian Leigh as Blanche and Marlon Brando as Stanley. It's directed by Elia Kazan, with Williams contributing to the screenplay. So he helped to produce the screenplay, making it from a play version into one that was fit for a film. And he had a lot to do with the involvement of producing the play version as well. Mind you, though, that if you are watching the play version or the film version as a way to revise, remember that there are some key differences. There are some elements cut out because they were cut out by censors who found it too overtly sexual, and also that the ending fundamentally is different because in the ending of the film version, Stella leaves Stanley. And that is where we are left at the end of the play. Again, that was a decision made and forced by censors who needed, based on the guidelines of censorship at the time in the 1940s, they needed to see the rapist punished, and that good reigned at the end of it. It's kind of this moral code linked with censorship at the time. So I'm going to read the summary of the play, just to remind you, especially if you haven't looked at this play in a while and now you're guiding yourself to revision. And I want you to think about this question in blue. Why A Streetcar Named Desire? Why in 1947? So what might be the reason for this play at this time? Put it in the chat as we think, okay? Blanche Dubois arrives to Elysian Fields in post-war New Orleans to stay with her younger married sister Stella, who is expecting her first child. The sisters have not seen each other in several years and are shown to be very different. Blanche clings to the old world values of the antebellum, which means before the war and particularly before the Civil War in the States. Antebellum South's high society, while Stella is much more engaged with the gritty modern life in New Orleans. Immediately, Blanche and Stanley Kowalski, Stella's husband, clash, and it is clear they have very different backgrounds and values. One point of contention is the sale of Belle Reve, Blanche and Stella's family home, a large but decaying plantation estate in Mississippi that Stella left years ago, and about which Blanche is bitter, devastated, and elusive. Tensions between Blanche and Stanley build over money, alcohol, lifestyle, and Blanche's excessive bathing, and Stella tries to keep the peace. Through this, Blanche is revealed to be condescending, demanding, and secretly drinking, and Stanley is revealed to be brutal, controlling, and very overtly sexual. Meanwhile, Blanche becomes interested in Mitch, one of Stanley's poker-playing friends, and a suspicious Stanley attempts to investigate Blanche's account of rich and influential beaux waiting to whisk her away. On Blanche's birthday, Stella throws her a small party. Here, Stanley reveals that Blanche has been fired from her teaching position for inappropriate liaisons with an underage student, which means she was having a sexual relationship with an underage student, with a 17-year-old boy who she was teaching, and was living in a hotel, possibly as a sex worker, before running out of money and coming to stay with Stella. Stanley presents Blanche with a bus ticket back to Mississippi and also reveals that he has told this information to Mitch, which is why Mitch has not arrived for the dinner. An argument ensues, and Stella, going into early labor, is rushed to the hospital. In a later scene, Mitch arrives to confront Blanche and attempts to rape her before leaving angrily. Stanley returns to the apartment, drunk and savagely happy about the birth of his son. Comes home and encounters Blanche, who is drunk and in a dissociative state. Stanley overpowers Blanche, and it is suggested that he rapes her. A doctor and nurse arrive to take Blanche to an institution. It appears she has suffered a complete breakdown after the rape and that she cannot separate reality from fantasy. Stella sadly watches her sister being taken away, unable to believe Blanche's account of the rape. So why A Streetcar Named Desire? Why in 1947? In the chat, put your ideas. Well, we've got this idea of A Streetcar Named Desire. Streetcar Named Desire was a real streetcar line in New Orleans at the time. So this idea of depicting real life here. Whilst also perhaps with this idea trying to capture something about contemporary life and the zeitgeist of the American South. Contemporary zeitgeist of the American South, particularly in the post-war period. We can also think of this as reflecting on the changes that were taking place at this time, the changes to class systems, the changes to societal structure. And that's a structure behind me. It's a symbol of New Orleans, yes, so it absolutely locates us very specifically in New Orleans. And not in a glamorous one, right? In a one that's defined by public transport and realism. We can also think of ideas about gender and systems of power here as changes as well. And even just changing attitudes here to society at the time. So we've got a load to talk about here and thinking about why this is an appropriate play to capture the ideas here, because we've got clashing, because we've got different ways of life, because we seem to have a lot of realism here, and because this seems to be aligned with literary and societal traditions and trends at the time, but particularly defining it in 1947 as an ideas about change to the dynamic. And as SH says, new versus old South, and we're going to talk about that. So let's talk a little bit about Tennessee Williams as well. So Tennessee Williams lived from 1911 to 1983. 1911 was born in Columbus, Mississippi, to a working-class traveling shoe salesman and a former Southern belle. That was his mother there. So notice immediately here that he also comes from a family of mixed class relations, with his father being working class and his mother, Edwina, being a former Southern belle, so being upper class there. His father was abusive and suffered from alcoholism. And Tennessee Williams, who was actually named Thomas Lanier Williams originally, suffered a nearly fatal bout of diphtheria as a child and was physically frail for his entire life. These ideas then of fragility already initiating with him. It says that his confinement for almost 18 months or even 2 years in some accounts describe how that made him quite an internally reflective child, and also very interested in literature because he wasn't able to see very many people and he wasn't very strong, especially in terms of going to school. But it also meant that he was physically frail for his entire life, but often also self-medicated with drugs and alcohol, and to many accounts was also a hypochondriac, very similar to his mother. And that both of them were very worried about health concerns, and this was in particular due to the treatment and struggles that they experienced with Tennessee Williams's sister, Rose, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and was very much beloved by Thomas Lanier, or Tennessee Williams, and they had a close relationship. And when Tennessee Williams was in university and away at university, their mother subjected her to a forced lobotomy. So Rose had been in and out of different institutions because of her needs and because of her mental health needs and expression as well across her life. And it also seemed to be associated that their mother really struggled with Rose's behavior because she was much more overt, particularly about things that were not polite for a lady, and particularly not for a Southern belle to speak about or act like, etc. So she was eventually subjected to a forced lobotomy, so the severing of the two parts of the brain, and this apparently, according to Tennessee Williams's accounts, severely impacted her personality, her behavior, and meant that she had to be institutionalized for the rest of her life. Now, when Tennessee Williams, he was initially devastated and seemingly continuously devastated across his life about this decision, but also when he was successful, he supported his sister's institutionalization financially, so she was able to be housed in private institutions and looked after and was supported by her brother as well. He also had another brother who, it sounds from a lot of accounts that he was estranged from for a long time. And this was perhaps due to his repressed sexuality, his drug and alcohol addiction, and mental health issues. So, as we said, Tennessee Williams was gay, was practicing gay in some instances, in particular in his later life, was pretty overt about his sexuality, but in his early life he was not able to be. And often at that time, homosexuality, sexuality more broadly, was absolutely taboo, and it seems that a lot of violence went with Tennessee Williams's experience of sexuality as well. After he left university, and firstly started university and really didn't like it, and then transferred into journalism, so then rooted himself in writing. And after university, he worked a variety of menial jobs, including working at factories. It's believed that his colleague from one of the factories in which he worked was the inspiration for Stanley Kowalski. And he also was trying to work at night. So his mother describes him coming in and out of work and then writing his whole entire free time and then going back to work again. So essentially not very much sleep and a lot of stress. And this led to an emotional breakdown. And oftentimes, Tennessee Williams himself was also institutionalized, either voluntarily or involuntarily, as a result of his mental health issues. It was in 1944, so already when Tennessee Williams was in his 30s, that he achieved success with The Glass Menagerie, which again is a play, again based in the South. There are a lot of similar themes to A Streetcar Named Desire. And then after that, with A Streetcar Named Desire, his second play, which won a Pulitzer Prize the same year and was extremely well received, was on Broadway, and then most of the Broadway cast was brought in for the 1951 film version. It was highly accredited, lots of awards offered, and Williams produced the screenplay, so it is pretty close to his design for the play. And he says in particular that Vivian Leigh, so the Blanche in the film version, is what he wanted and more. So there is loads of connection there. It's helpful to watch and very interesting to watch, but just be mindful that there are a couple of changes there. The third, sort of the trifecta of Williams' plays and success is Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which again, very similar themes, wins Williams a second Pulitzer. Across his life, and particularly his adult life, he was very turbulent with mental health, with work, with physical health, as well as being involved in abusive relationships. Again, perhaps drawing from them in order to craft the character of Stanley Kowalski. In 1983, he died of a suspected overdose, and particularly was linked to addiction with barbiturates. He wanted to be buried, in his will, it says, as close as possible to Hart Crane, who was another contemporary poet and also someone who struggled with their repressed sexuality and who committed suicide at sea. Unfortunately, this was not honoured in his will, and he was buried next to his parents. And in his will, he left his money to his sister, who he'd supported throughout his life. When we think about the plays of Williams, there are some major themes that absolutely stand out. Disillusionment, repressed sexuality, violence and destruction and self-destruction, illusion versus reality, determinism, which is believing that your life has been determined for you, and particularly that your choices determine your trajectory, etc. As well as time, especially tension between past and present, Southern values and society, love and desire, moral and spiritual decay, death, isolation, and fragility and vulnerability. And how does this link to Williams and A Streetcar Named Desire? Well, Elia Kazan, the director of the 1951 version, described that everything in Williams's life is in his plays, and everything in his plays is in his life. So in your own answers in the chat. To what extent do you agree here? Feel free to put your reflection in the chat for how this stands out. And again, if we're thinking about Williams's intention here, we can absolutely use Kazan's quotation here, perhaps in our introduction, perhaps in our conclusion, perhaps as part of building our argument, to think about the fact that Williams is reflecting something about his own life and engaging with ideas from his own life. And their ideas, yes, are those of tensions between classes. This is something that he experienced, as I said, in his own family. Abusive relationships, again, through his own family. Masculinity, especially with his father, who is depicted as particularly violent, dominant, masculine, etc. This idea of unequal power dynamics, repressed sexuality, love, death, Southern ideals and Southern identities, mental health, breakdowns, drugs and alcohol, violence, and this idea of isolation, one that in particular stands out because it is one that can be offered when we think about Blanche, because she is a character who is isolated across the play and is marked out for her isolation and distance from society increasingly as we go across the play. So it might be a word that you haven't thought about as a theme that could come up for A Streetcar Named Desire, but consider it and think about that as something that absolutely does stand out when we think about Blanche's characterization, is the fact that she is alone. And then fragility and vulnerability, also particularly important, because Williams himself describes how he is trying to show and how he has sympathy for those who are fragile and vulnerable in society and are often victims as a result of it. We will get a little bit more into that as well. SH, to an extent you see some aspects of his life through characters such as Blanche, Alan Gray, absolutely. Yes, indeed. And Williams himself has described that Blanche is him in drag. So trying to couch his own experiences with sexuality, with suffering, with abuse, with addiction, etc., in a perhaps more societally palatable, acceptable form at the time, by putting himself in a woman's character, but really trying to express ideas about himself. And absolutely Alan Gray as well, hugely important there. And let's talk about context now. So Streetcar Named Desire was set and first performed in 1947, whose zeitgeist, or whose mainstream culture, was defined by the Great Depression, as I said, which is, of course, this huge, decades-long economic suffering and disruption to the class hierarchy, particularly to the status and power and positioning of upper class and middle class people, because they lost all of their money and resources often. And it disrupted the class system because it made everyone equal to a certain extent. There was 14 million unemployed people in the United States in 1933. And this is something that the characters would have gone through because they are all older than 8, 9, 10. So they would have experienced this. And this is thinking about, okay, perhaps why the state of Belle Reve, why Blanche is in such desperate financial situations right now. It's exacerbated by the losses that they would have incurred in the Great Depression, and also speaks to who is able to survive those kinds of economic struggles. We think about Stanley and the drive he has, right? That he's the only person of his friends who's likely to get anywhere, right? So he's the consummate survivor here. And the same with World War II. He describes, talking about experiences when they're playing poker in the final scene 11, about luck. As he was in the World War II serving with Mitch as well in the engineer corps. So he was a skilled and powerful officer there who had lots of brass on him, so loads of medals. So he was clearly brave and successful there as well. Something, an officer position, a master sergeant, not something that he would have been able to access previously because he was working class. So the fact that he's risen in the ranks, not because he is upper class and has gone to military school to become an officer, but because he has ascended the ranks as a result of his bravery or his success in the war. We can also think about New Orleans, which was previously an extremely poor area with over 30% unemployment. But after the World War, and during, in fact, even the World War, became part of this southern boom. It has a really key location because it is on waterways and adjacent to the Gulf of Mexico, of thinking about transport and thinking about industry. And it became an industrial and manufacturing hub. And the South more broadly did as well, after and during the Second World War, because factories, steel mills, plants were built there. Military bases as well. Often some of the biggest military bases are still located in the American South. And something that's very minorly mentioned when we talk about Blanche in Mississippi, that the officers or the army base, the soldiers were told that it was an off limits to go to Belle Reve. And so as a result of this boom and in manufacturing, there were thousands of people now able to get jobs. And there was influx of people coming from Eastern Europe and from Central and South America. So Eastern Europe, we're thinking about Stanley here, whose family has Polish ancestry, and people like Pablo, who is one of Stanley's poker group, who speaks Spanish here, and so clearly is also, like Stanley, from an immigrant background. And we see this as well with the diversity even foregrounded in the first scene, where we have a black woman and a white woman speaking as Stanley and Stella first interact, and as Blanche arrives. And later we see people from different cultures in a diverse group surrounding and as minor characters in A Streetcar Named Desire, whereas this would be very juxtaposed to Belle Reve and the culture that Stella and Blanche would have grown up in. So with this as well, we also need to think about the disruption to previously entrenched social hierarchies in the post-war period. So as a result of the losses, the extensive losses from World War and from the disruption of the war to their ways of life and the disillusionment afterwards, we do have disruption to the social hierarchies. So this means that society is no longer based on the same restrictions, the same rules, the same systems of power as they were before the wars, not least because so many people died, but also because society now looks different and people no longer can fall into those same habits and same systems of power. There is also widespread disillusionment after World War II, which means that people, not only in real life, but also if we think about trends in literature, art, architecture, of thinking about them as wanting to portray something more realistic. And the rise of postmodernism, for example, so thinking about reality, this particularly growing in the Great Depression, where artists, like for example in Migrant Mother, portray real people really undergoing real struggles, and particularly a focus on working class, gritty, industrial looks to them. And so people were not willing to engage with these fantasies and with these former ways of life. There was a society of very quick, rapid change. With this as well, there was a huge push of urban migration to meet the needs of these new factories. Society, after the Civil War in the American South and after the emancipation of slavery, meant that the largely agrarian, so largely farm-based, agriculture-based plantation-based society was now changing to an urban society. So people were moving to cities to work in factories rather than working on plantations. And as a result of the end of enslavement, plantations were no longer as powerful because they were not anymore relying on free labor as a result of exploitation. So that meant that workers suddenly were more empowered to make their own money, and that they went to places that were no longer those same systems of power. So the plantation owners were being supplanted by new money, who were factory owners, industrialists, manufacturing wealth, who began to rival plantation owners in their power in society. And plantation owners, this old money group, and we'll talk about the old and new South in a moment as well, were losing their power in society that had been established and maintained across generations, were now losing it, and they were being supplanted by this new money that looked very different, because often they came from a working class background and had ascended through their own hard work, struggle and drive, as Stella describes of Stanley. And as well, we've got the emergence of second wave feminism. And we'll talk again more about this in a moment. But this is second wave of feminism is developing after the Second World War, because women, remember, as men went off to fight, women had to follow the and keep up society. Hello, Sophie. Thank you for joining us. So women had to fulfill men's roles at home, in factories, in society, in the public sphere, whereas previously they had not needed to. And when men came back from war, they expected women to go back to the domestic sphere, and women were resistant to that because they had been proving that they wanted to and could have a role outside of the domestic sphere, and especially to have a career and power in society. So this would be the first rumblings of it. Remember, women still financially dependent on men, especially in control of the household, as we can see through Stella, as we can see even through Blanche. But this is the idea of change and turbulence here. So the Old South, and let's get into this here. Old South's economy depended on trade and agricultural exports. So previously, and in the Old South was responsible for raw materials, chiefly cotton, oil, fruit, livestock. The North was the manufacturing hub. So the South produced these goods and then shipped them to the North. So the people who were in power were the people who owned land and thus owned the goods and profited from the goods that were being created here. So this depended on land ownership and intergenerational power. You okay, Sophie? Yes, I roll outside of the sphere. Okay, great. Streetcar named Desire. So it depended on raw goods, it depended on enslavement, and it depended on northern manufacturing. So this meant that power was intrinsically linked to enslavement, to domination, and to intergenerational wealth. So these were the landowners who profited from goods grown on plantations, often considered the Southern aristocracy. We see this in the Southern Belles. If you've seen or read Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara is the classic example of this, as is Blanche. Belle Reve, in its heyday, so in its best times, its most powerful times, would have been this, particularly in the 16, 17, 1800s. It would have been a powerful place where Blanche and Stella would have been in that inner circle of power and society. This is in contrast to the plain folk. Whoops, apologies. The plain folk, who would be the workers, who would have worked on the plantations and later in factories, who also served in professions as well. They would be completely separate in society from the planter class, who would have socialized exclusively together. This would have been originally Stanley in the Old South term. So there would just be no interaction other than employer and employee, or master and servant, or even enslaved person between these two levels of society. Are we okay? Just double checking. One of the human mods. Okay, great. Yes, good. We do have Halia here as well as Zakia, who are here to mod and join in for us and answer any questions you may have. But this is no longer so powerful. So the planter class would have been Bel Rev, plain folk would have been the workers, and then we have the hill people, which we don't see in A Streetcar Named Desire, but are those rural enclaves which had limited access to urban resources. Named so because they were mainly based in the Appalachian Mountains. This is in contrast to the New South. The Industrial Revolution, which took place slightly later in America than it did in the UK, led to the emergence of a class of new money capitalists. Now, the old money or Old South society would not have considered these people equals. As a matter of fact, they would have seen them still as how they were born, as working class people. But these are the people who, as I said, have drive and who get anywhere from their origins, which is exactly how Stella describes Stanley. This third Great Awakening also led to social reforms which included widespread education for people who previously would not have had access to it, as well as reforms about alcohol consumption and religious beliefs. And this as well, so thinking about this with Stanley and Stella, Stanley describes himself as he was never a very good English student. But this is where we think about the interaction between them and the fact that people now are able to access education who wouldn't have beforehand. And then as well, the Immigration Act of 1924, which led to restrictions of Eastern European and Mediterranean immigrants who had arrived in large waves of migrations since the 1890s. So as I said, Eastern European would have been Stanley's family when they had arrived from Poland. But this idea of the restrictions, because there were so many new immigrants coming to the US, was that there were limitations on who could come from where and who was welcome there. And so it was very common to be facing prejudice, widespread prejudice, because of one's immigration status here. And we can see that embodied in Blanche's language about Stanley, describing him as a brute, describing him as bestial, ape-like, subhuman, are encapsulating the ideas from the chat. Sophie, feel free to stay along for learning if you like. Okay. And then with New Orleans becoming a melting pot versus us thinking about New Orleans in particular because of its proximity to Central and South America, as well as it as a hub of industry, as well as it as a port, meant that it was an extremely diverse society, as we can see in the first scene with the interaction and even in the initial stage directions, as well as Stanley's heterogeneous types that he socializes with and that are considered his friends in Stella's language. So thinking about it as a mixed society where the rigid class system, the rigid race system as well of the Old South would no longer apply. And then thinking finally about the development of jazz as an art form established by Black Americans with its epicenter in New Orleans. We see this across the play, the continuous blue piano, the hot trumpet, the drums, the jungle. We can see this as linked to the setting of the Kowalski's apartment, as well as even in Stanley's language, when he says, cut the rebop, that's a word borrowed from jazz language, which suggests that this is Stanley's place, Stanley's world, and that Stanley is connected to these modern ideas. So here, let's then think of the Old South versus the New South. And Robert S. Cotterill, who wrote The Old South to the New, describes this tension between Old and New South as, since the people of the New South, looking around them, saw nothing even remotely resembling it, the nostalgically imagined Old South, they reasoned quite logically that it must have died. And then there were some people then who viewed the deployment of manufacturing as a surrender of Southern ideals and the adoption of a low Yankee culture, Yankee being Northern. Remember, North, South in the United States at this time, and particularly the South, still bristling from its encounters with the North during the World Wars, thinking of it as the antagonist. Are you okay, Sophie? Okay. So if we think about what these quotations mean and how these characters and events reflect these ideas, we can think of this as encapsulating Blanche's attitudes, right? This idea of the Old South as associated with death being portrayed through Blanche's character, who is also the embodiment of these Old South values, but also continuously linked with death, dying out, decay, deterioration, etc. And then thinking of this as a surrender of Southern ideals, this is when Blanche is talking to Stella and thinking of don't hang back with the brutes in this dark march, thinking about how horrified she is about Stella's current life. This is thinking about how she feels that Stella has given up things like poetry and music in order to be with Stanley. Whereas we can see that Stella has a very different view of things. And this idea of adoption of a low Yankee culture, this idea of a low culture, a modern culture being associated with lowness, with working class culture, does very much link to both Blanche's attitude and those of the Old South. And Tennessee Williams himself, quoted by his mother in Remember Me to Tom, a memoir, describes, "It is out of regret for a South that no longer exists that I write of the forces that destroyed it." Again, interesting here, because we're thinking about regret, this idea of sympathy here for the Old South, that nostalgic past that no longer exists. So the idea of Blanche then being a relic of a past world, and thinking of the forces that destroyed it being perhaps Stanley, but also the forces of modernity with which she's associated, as well as time, as well as progress, as well as violence and brutality with that destroyed it there as well. So we're thinking about this, reflecting the ideas of the Old and New South in the play, with this conflict between between Stanley and Blanche, in which Stella is caught and must choose. We think about the sympathy that we have for Blanche as a character through Williams's qualified but sympathetic portrayal. We think of Blanche as embodying the ideals of the Old South and Stanley of the New. We think even about Stella adapting from the Old South to the New South to survive because it's the only way, because as we can see here from scholars and from the playwright themselves, that this is the only way to survive because the values and ways of the Old South no longer exist. They've been destroyed. Feel free to put any questions in the chat here. And if we don't have questions, and I can pause for a second if we do, then let's talk about Men and Women in 1947. Because with Men and Women, we can think as well about the characters not only symbolizing something about class and about society, but also about gender, and thus think about things with an intersectional lens, which means we're looking at how both class and gender influence perhaps people like Stella or Blanche, who have some power as a result of their class, but also have less power as a result of their gender. So there is complex ideas here, which mean that they can be both powerful in a way, but also powerless in a way. So I'm going to read these ideas and think about how you can borrow these ideas and incorporate them into your analysis. So feel free again to put them in the chat. So first performed in 1947, as we know, this play speaks to the position of and dynamic between women and men in the post-war era. Women, briefly empowered to leadership at home during the wars, were compelled to return to the domestic sphere when men returned to the domestic workforce. The late 1940s and 1950s brought and heralded a return to conservatism and traditional gender roles that drew from the cult of domesticity. Women were again expected to serve as the ideal wife and mother and to forfeit the freedoms of financial and social independence for one defined by the patriarchal culture of hegemonic masculinity embodied by Stanley Kowalski. Hegemonic masculinity means this dominant form of masculinity in a patriarchy that is linked with violence, domination, brutality, and thinks about legitimizing men's dominance in a society. Okay, so just so you know what that means. So that's definitely Stanley Kowalski, isn't it? Stanley fulfills the expectations of 1940s men, who were expected to be the breadwinner, to maintain physical, financial, and social control over their wives. We can see this because there is an element of performativity, too, in Stanley's control over Stella, for example, during the poker games. Expressions of masculinity also depended on the maintenance of male-male relationships. Stanley's dominance in the poker group clearly indicates his superior status both in the domestic sphere as well as more broadly in society. Perhaps in portraying Stanley, arguably the play's antagonist, as a brutal and violent figure whose abuse extends not only to his pregnant wife, but also to his sister-in-law, Williams is critiquing the violence and domination that is inherent to hegemonic masculinity. Interesting that we say arguably here, right? That I said arguably here, because most people, when they read or watch Streetcar Named Desire, they think Stanley is definitely the enemy here. But if we look at this with a Marxist lens, so looking at it in terms of class and how class is portrayed, a Marxist lens argues that Stanley is actually the hero and that his behavior is justifiable because he is defeating the forces of the bourgeoisie who are trying to oppress him. He's overthrowing this class system that has oppressed him for so long, and he wins. So in some productions that highlight this Marxist lens to it, we've had audiences cheer when Stanley eventually brutally overpowers and perhaps rapes Blanche, because it's seen as the defeat of the bourgeoisie rather than as an idea of gender. And with this as well, let's take a look at the second paragraph, thinking as well, how can you link this to analysis of Stanley as well as the female characters we're going to look at here. So in A Streetcar Named Desire, we see three women's negotiation of women's expected role. Blanche depends on men to look after her both financially and socially, but her history of sexual profligacy and inappropriate relationships with minors condemns her to social exclusion by the end of the play. Eunice Hubble, who's Stella's upstairs neighbour, is physically abused by her husband, but appears to be physically abusive to him as well. In a way, their relationship, despite its tumultuousness, belies a sense of equality between the two. Stella, somewhere between these two, is submissive to her powerful and masculine husband. Violence towards her is normalized, and she's financially dependent on him. For example, she says, he doesn't even give me an allowance. However, she's also seemingly sexually satisfied, and as a social superior to her husband, is privy to knowledge to which he does not have access. So, for example, the difference between rhinestones and diamonds. She also seeks her own pleasure and is able to act as a conduit between these two worlds embodied by Blanche and Stanley. Her pregnancy and baby, and perhaps her acceptance of the new social order, provide her with a different future than Blanche, who is destroyed at the end of the play. This complex presentation of femininity in A Streetcar Named Desire may reflect both women's own struggles with identity, as he has described that Blanche in a way is himself in drag, as well as the emergence of second-wave feminism, which captured the tensions between women's agency, patriarchal oppression, and societal forces. So, How do we incorporate this? We can incorporate this when we think about Stanley's embodiment of masculinity of the time, and him as the embodiment of those ideas rather than just as a character. We can think of him as this figure that is used to comment on the violence and domination linked to this kind of masculinity here. We can also think of women here as three different expressions of this same role. Blanche and her trajectory, because of her failure to submit to Stanley, because of her failure in her past to fulfill expectations for women, is doomed. Eunice, because she is abusive towards her husband as well as receives abuse, she is someone who, in a way, is a more positive experience within this deeply violent system. And with Stella, we've got this idea of her being a conduit between these two worlds and being both sexually satisfied and superior in a class way, as well as submissive, dependent, and ultimately saved by her pregnancy and baby, as well as perhaps her acceptance, which means she is able to survive and Blanche is not. And again, thinking of this as linked to second wave feminism as well. And these final ideas of the Madonna whore dichotomy, which we looked at with Othello as well, thinking about Blanche attempting to fill this Madonna, but falling into the whore category of that dichotomy, whereas Stella, even though she is sexually satisfied and clearly sexually active, because she's a wife and a mother, she is a Madonna. And Eunice as a kind of neither of those, and thus separate in a way from that dynamic, despite the language used around her. So we can think then of this idea of hierarchy there. How do people get power? And not only through class, but through gender. So for example, with Stanley, Blanche threatens his position in the hierarchy, and so must be forced into submission. And we're thinking about spheres of control. So beyond the home, dominant in all aspects of society, and it's Stanley's way of life that wins because he wins and because he is this fulfillment of contemporary masculinity. Again, feel free to put any ideas into the chat, and let's talk settings. So here with settings, we've got a couple of different ideas. We've got Elysian Fields, which is a neighborhood in New Orleans that is served by the Desire streetcar line. Elysian Fields is an allusion to Greek mythology for the afterlife. So it's where people go when they've crossed the river Styx, and particularly is known as a kind of almost a meadow in a way of, and a state of blissful oblivion. So Blanche says, I want to rest. This idea of Elysian Fields and blissful oblivion, forgetting, escape, etc. are all associated here. She's come here not only to Elysian Fields, but also to New Orleans, which was a multicultural city of both aristocratic history, so founded by French colonists, particularly French Huguenots, which is what Blanche says that their name, Dubois, comes from. Their ancestors are French Huguenot, and also an epicenter, as we said, of post-war industry. So this is a world and a city in which Blanche and Stanley and Stella and Stanley can both exist at the same time and can both be in the same apartment at the same time, whereas previously they would not have been. So there is this clash and collective that has disbanded hierarchy of the past. We also, of course, across the play have this setting of the Kowalski's first floor apartment, which is cramped. It's in the French Quarter in New Orleans. It is claustrophobic. It's the domestic sphere. So we don't see the four deuces. We don't see really outside of the home. We can only see on the porch, just outside and within. So this idea then of these characters as circling here and this microcosm of society here. And with this as well, we've also got Belle Reve, which is Blanche and Stella's lost family home. We never see it, and perhaps that's because it's already been lost. We'll talk about the name in a moment, but this would have been a plantation-style big house in Laurel, Mississippi that is described as fine in its heyday, so fine as in lovely, really glamorous and luxurious in its heyday, but has since fallen into disrepair. That's important, right? Because this is really Blanche as well, isn't it? Due to lack of money and harsh creditors, as well as the suggested to be tragic early deaths of many Dubois relatives. So Belle Reve linked with previous glamour and luxury, disrepair currently, loss, death. And what symbolic purposes might these settings serve? Well, let's take a look, shall we? Because these would be the two settings that are being juxtaposed here. With Belle Reve, this is a once elegant plantation. It would have been a status symbol. People would know the name. This is the name of the house, which means this is a place that has a name because it has status in society. Belle Reve means beautiful dream, which means that this is immediately and intrinsically linked to fantasy, illusion, lack of reality, right? But because it's lost, it's almost this idea as the dream is lost, the nostalgia, the idea of the Old South have been lost here. And now we've woken up and we've entered reality. So Belle Reve is lost. It's associated with Blanche, of course, because she's just come supposedly from there. It's also associated with their ancestors, with death, and the ancestors' epic fornications that has led to the loss of this place, limited down to 20 acres, which is the size of quite a big park now. So thinking about that was the smallest version it got to, it would have been hundreds of acres at its heyday. So it would have been a previous indicator of power, class, history, the Old South, and intergenerational wealth, because there have been ancestors in this house for generations and generations. And this is juxtaposed with the Kowalski's first floor apartment. So a setting that we never see compared to a setting that we see for the whole of the play. And that's interesting as well, isn't it? Because with this here, we've got this place with the columns, and we have the characters showing each other a snapshot or a photograph of Belle Reve, but we never see it. And it's continuously defined as linked as the place with all the white columns here as well. So thinking about the white columns as linked again with status, this idea of a pillar, of luxury, because of course houses that have columns are often very expensive. And they're also linked to that kind of classical style that places like the White House are also built in the same style. So again, thinking of ideas of status here, as well as white. So again, that idea of Blanche, again, further linked to Belle Reve. And this is in contrast to the Kowalski's first floor apartment, which is extremely cramped, very real, claustrophobic. And if you've ever shared a bedroom with one of your siblings, you can understand how very close quarters or very limited space often forces tension or confrontation and also magnifies extremes. So thinking about this as building and antagonizing the conflict here. It's associated with Stanley, Stella, and modernity. We can hear the sounds of the city throughout with the bars, the L&M locomotive tracks that are outside, cats screeching, people arguing, people making up from arguing, sex workers and drunks fighting, piano playing, bar noises. And interestingly, the blue piano, when it's initially described, is described as expressing the spirit of the life that goes on here. So very much in contrast to Belle Reve, which is associated continuously with death, this is associated with life, with busyness, with modernity, and with survival. Not luxury, but certainly with life. And it's interesting as well, if you look back at those initial stage directions of the scene, it is linking these two ideas together as we see our characters enter the scenes, because it's described as faded white, there's an atmosphere of decay, but it also has a raffish charm. And so there's this element of deteriorating grandeur that really captures both of these ideas and their relationship here. And who survives this crossing from one to the other? Well, Stella, from past to present, from lost to living, because she has fallen in status but accepted it. So she is associated now with the first floor apartment, whereas previously she'd been associated with this snapshot, but it's a relic, and she has accepted that it had to be sacrificed in order for them to continue living. Now let's think tragedy. Thank you, Mavis, for joining us. Appreciate you. So in what ways is Streetcar Named Desire a tragedy? Well, of course, we've got Blanche's destruction at the end. And if you're thinking about Shakespearean tragedy, you might think, well, that requires someone to die at the end, the main character in particular, the tragic hero, to die at the end. But in a way, even though Blanche is only escorted out of the apartment and to a mental institution with the doctor and the matron, we do get this idea that she's going to her death, or that perhaps her mental collapse in a way is her spiritual and mental death here. We get the idea as well that she's not going to be leaving this institution. So this idea that she's either going to spend the rest of her life there or she's going to die pretty quickly. We have these ideas as well of an unstoppable trajectory. That she, Blanche, who's our tragic hero, arguably, is on an unstoppable trajectory, literally, right? Because she's on a streetcar and streetcars are on tracks. So when she goes from desire to cemeteries to Elysian fields, she is on an unstoppable trajectory from sex and desire to death and the afterlife. So to, in other words, her destruction. So it's prefiguring her destruction. We want to think about a tragic hero. We want to think about hamartia, so the fatal flaw. Arguable for Blanche what this is, if it's her inability to accept reality, to adapt, her lies, her deception or self-deception. SH, she fulfills the tragic conventions to an extent. I would say so, certainly. Yes, for example, the idea that she's a character who goes from high to low or no status. For example, she's a character who falls and is destroyed. Certainly. We also, with tragedy, have these ideas of decline, deterioration, and destruction. And interestingly, do we have another key element of tragedy? Catharsis. Do we feel relieved at the end of the play? Do we feel resolved at the end of the play? This is an arguable point. I think there are arguments to be made for both, right? That you do because the inevitable happens and Blanche is taken away because there's no way she can survive here and everything is resolved and the people who can live on, live on. Or we can think about this as deeply uncathartic because it is the villain is unpunished, someone who's vulnerable is destroyed, and we don't know what's going to happen any further with Stella, with Stanley, with Blanche at all. Even with Mitch, we don't know. We also need to think about this idea of blame. Who is to blame for the ending? At the end of, if we think about Shakespearean tragedies, we know who's to blame, and it's the tragic hero and their choices, or perhaps external forces like fate. But here, blame is really a difficult question because of our complex characters and complex ideas we have. Now, here I've put together some ideas to show you how Shakespearean tragedy or early modern plays are different from modern plays, because it's important to think about why someone like Tennessee Williams, who is helping to promote and advance modern tragedy, is doing differently than Shakespeare, because those differences would be intentional choices done on purpose. So early modern plays, 5 acts, internal forces determine trajectory, so the hamartia. It centers on royalty and nobles, often open-air theatres, minimal scenery, natural lighting, so the focus is on dialogue and performance. They can't do really the fancy special effects that we could do otherwise. There are no female actors. There are grand or mystical settings like royal courts, forests, and banquets, and it's often used as entertainment and moral instruction. Societal critiques are often couched necessarily in historical, exoticized settings out of fear of political repercussions. Whereas in modern plays, it's typically 2 acts or a series of scenes. So we really have the climax of A Streetcar Named Desire in scene 10 out of 11. And perhaps this stems from Williams's interest and strengths in writing mini scenes rather than full plays. But also we think about this as disrupting the expected trajectory of Freytag's pyramid, right? And of the 5-act structure here. We can also think of the important part here, the external forces of class, gender, race, society, in combination with internal forces determine the trajectory. So this idea that things out of one's control, but things that are in society, your identity, in other words, often, or power structures that exist, are what determine one's trajectory. It's not exactly their fault. It often centers on common working class people rather than nobles. Interesting again, because thinking about elevating and appreciating and validating the common person's experience. And the modern technology of indoor theatres means more complex scenery. We don't really have complex scenery in A Streetcar Named Desire, but we certainly have lighting and special effects. Polka music, jazz playing, cats screeching, lights going on and off, shadows, etc. We have actors of dual genders, of course, and we have realistic quotidian, which means daily life settings meant to portray daily life. So we're meant to be showing, rather than forests and banquets and courts, real life, like Stanley being the king in his apartment. And then it often incorporates the Ibsen effect, which is a kind of moral analysis of characters used to critique society. So in this, again, the Ibsen effect is replacing external fate with internal, social, or psychological determinants. So things in society, characters, or psychology that determines the trajectory rather than fate. That dead beliefs, like the Old South, continue to haunt the living, or expectations of women continue to haunt the living, and that ghosts of social convention, heredity, and hypocrisy that restrict individual freedoms and lead to catastrophe. So this idea that the things that people inherit, either from history from society, or from their own failure to do what they say, limit people and lead to disaster. All of that sounds like Blanche, right? So we can absolutely incorporate the Ibsen effect and the ideas of modern tragedy if we think about who's to blame here and whether this is a tragedy. So Arthur Miller, who also wrote the most famous foreword for A Streetcar Named Desire, which is in this version of this edition of the play, which you might have. Miller was a contemporary playwright as well, wrote The Crucible, and wrote this in Tragedy and the Common Man, which is an essay. I believe that the common man is an apt a subject for tragedy in its highest sense as kings were. The possibility of victory must be there in tragedy. Where pathos rules, where pathos is finally derived, a character has fought a battle he could not possibly have won. The pathetic is achieved when the protagonist, by virtue of his witlessness, his insensitivity, or the very air he gives off, incapable of grappling with a much superior force. So this idea then that people who are common, who are normal, everyday people, are as allowed to be in tragedy and the subject of tragedy as Macbeth or Hamlet, which was a new idea at the time. And that these characters simply need to fight a battle that's impossible, that's doomed from the start. That's what makes them tragic. It's that they are working against something that is going to destroy them, that's unstoppable. Blanche, trying to live in the past, trying to replicate the past, trying to escape progress. She's doomed from the start, right? The same way with what Raymond Chandler says in Modern Tragedy. We have to see not only that suffering is avoidable, but that it is not avoided. And not only that suffering breaks us, but that it need not break us. So this idea then that if Blanche adapted, accepted, was honest, she wouldn't be destroyed. So it is her fate is avoidable. She just doesn't avoid it. And that is tragic as well, as SH says, fulfills the tragic conventions. Yes. And Werner Foster in Desire, Death and Laughter says, I do not wish to suggest that anything Blanche does excuses Stanley for the crime of rape, but rather that her own complicity in bringing it about produces the tragic inevitability of her downfall and makes Blanche a tragic figure rather than merely a victim. So here we're thinking then of Blanche as not just a victim, but also as part of the intense and complex situation that leads to this conflict between them. So not, of course, not that she is blamed for her own rape, but just that the circumstances of her choices and the circumstances that then follow are interlinked. So she does become not just a victim in a play, but a tragic hero and a tragic figure. Some other context here, especially thinking about genre. We have got the American Gothic. So Blanche herself says, only Poe, only Mr. Edgar Allan Poe could do it justice. Remember, she's an English teacher. So she does have a very romanticized literary view of things. Poe, one of the most famous figures attached to Gothic literature, famous for writing about decay, instability, repression, and downfalls. And the American Gothic is developed through Poe's work as well as the work of other playwrights and other writers, including William Faulkner, who Williams credits as some of his inspiration. So the American Gothic there is what we're talking about when we're talking about the genre of A Streetcar Named Desire, which is a subsection of Gothic fiction, a literary genre defined by decay, loss of control, a blurring of reality, fantasy and dream, and a building sense of unease and suspense. If we think about A Streetcar Named Desire, tick, 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 right? We've got all of those things. So that means it's definitely falling into the Gothic genre. And oftentimes the Gothic fiction centers on a sense of loss, a fixation with death, and a suppression of feelings, usually with disastrous or tragic results. American Gothic fiction draws from the imagery of Puritan America. The seedy underbelly of society was uncontrollable and feared and needed to be punished to preserve the way of life. This idea of the exposure of Blanche's past as the seedy underbelly of society, their situation and setting being the seedy underbelly as well, and that whoever is deviant in that society needs to be punished. So Blanche being like a witch in Puritan America. An imagery of hell is often included and juxtaposed strongly with ideas of heaven. Think about Stanley's red satin pajamas, the jungle sounds, the screeching, right? The four deuces there as the name of the bar around the corner. Elysium Fields, even. And heaven appears to be much further off than hell. So really, we only have heaven when we have escape there. For example, when Blanche says, sometimes there's God so quickly, and those ideas, but of course we know that that's fated. And so it really is much closer to hell than to heaven. Southern American Gothic fiction focuses on the decay and decline of the American South in the post-Civil War period in particular, and emphasizes tense power dynamics dependent on race and gender, and often includes plantations as settings. We don't have a plantation as a setting here, but we have it as a place that we are speaking about. And they often contain an anti-hero, so a hero who is not heroic or not a conventional hero, who does not exhibit the same moral fortitude as an archetypal protagonist. So we don't have Blanche as a heroic person, right? We have her as weak, morally corrupt, hypocritical, prejudiced, deceitful, but she's still the center of our sympathies for the most part. And as I said, Williams references Faulkner, as well as Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter through Blanche's language, and of course Edgar Allan Poe several times. And what conventions of Gothic fiction appear in A Streetcar Named Desire? Well, we've got quite a few here, don't we? If we think about these ideas here, and the suppression of feelings here, if we think about the desire and the revealing of desire between Stanley and Blanche across the play, and even ideas like the tamale seller saying red hots were associated with sexuality, with sinfulness, and with red as well, just as it is in the Scarlet Letter. And of course, we've got the decay and decline of the American South, post-Civil War, plantations, tense power dynamics, anti-hero. So we've got loads here. So we can certainly reference the American Gothic as part of this as well. And then the rise of social realism. Leaney describes that Williams was an ultra-realist. Williams himself describes that he only has one major theme for his work, which is the destructive power of society on the sensitive, nonconformist individual. Sensitive nonconformist is definitely Blanche, right? Because Stanley does conform to 1947 masculinity and society more broadly. So we're thinking of Williams as considering society, it's society versus Blanche, and how that is destroyable. And Williams also says when a play employs unconventional techniques, it should not be trying to escape the responsibility of dealing with reality, but should be attempting to find a closer approach, a more penetrating and vivid expression of things as they are. So he views dealing with reality as a responsibility of a writer then. So thus that he is trying to capture something about real life in his presentations of Stanley, Stella, and Blanche. And social realism was a movement that was contemporary at the time in both literature and art, that seeks to present realistic scenes of daily life, particularly for working class people, in order to critique the real socio-political conditions and institutional power structures that created and reinforced these conditions. This movement rose particularly in France in the 19th century European realism movement, so post-French Revolution, where there's a focus on working class culture and the noble presentation, the proud presentation of working class culture. And then in a more modern format during the Great Depression in the United States, we see lots of gritty images and pieces of art. Steinbeck falls into this as well as The Migrant Mother, which is a photograph that is very recognizable as part of social realism by Dorothea Lange. And this is meant to reveal the struggle and poverty of disillusioned and disempowered workers within society. So this is not showing Stanley and Mitch as loving their work at the factory, right? It's just showing that they are workers. They work hard. They sweat. They don't have a huge amount of money. They gamble. And they don't believe necessarily in these concepts of pre-war society, of God and religion and things. They believe more in the self-made man, for example. And in what ways could Williams' play be considered a work of social realism? Well, it does depict the gritty reality of 1947 New Orleans, the violence, the abuse, the poverty. And what does Williams say himself? He says, I think all my plays have had, subliminally at least, a great deal of social content. So clearly he's trying to depict or comment on reality. And he says, consequently, I'm not a political person, except that I'm a revolutionary. So this disruption of tragic conventions, portraying people and ideas in a newer way, in a revolutionary way, rather than showing them in a glamorous way, an idealized way, etc., is a new idea. What's his intention? To highlight the realities, to critique the consequences of illusion, to reflect on or sympathize with those nostalgic ideas of the past, to depict how they were destroyed, to reveal oft-hidden ideas or often obscured ideas about sexuality, poverty, abuse, violence, to question the brutality and what's lost in this march towards progress or to whatever is coming. And a reflection on the negative side, the inevitability of victimization for some. If you like, you could also say that this is a poignant comment on. Williams makes a poignant comment on, and then talk about what is it he's trying to talk about here. And let's look at some characters, shall we? By thinking about particularly our major characters here. So Blanche Dubois, obviously, and arguably our protagonist. Name means white woods, so associated, as she says, think about it as an orchard in spring, then associating herself with fertility, new life, idealism, purity with this whiteness. But of course, also she says her name is French, from her ancestors were French Huguenots. And her name means white, but it also means blank. So this idea of idealization, beauty, purity, these old world values of a Southern belle, but also the vulnerability that she could be written on, she could be stained, she is not able to escape her past no matter how much she bathes herself, right? So linking to these ideas of cleanliness, bathing, masking, hiding from the light, delicacy, as well as this idea of emptiness and loss because she is blank. In terms of Blanche means blank as well as white. So this idea of she has nothing, she's completely disempowered in society as a subaltern here. And this woods even compared to the city as this country word that would be more associated with Belle Reve and orchards than the city. Stella, then Stella for star, so it means star, and is she perhaps this beacon of light? So Blanche tries to hide the light, tries to mask light, tries to dim the light, tries to avoid the light, but Stella is light. She's a beacon of light and hope for herself, for Stanley, for Blanche as well. She's this connecting light that's trying to guide Blanche into the future and is trying to raise up Stanley as well. it's tough to say if she has to limit that light as well. But we do see that light as surviving, right? That she is able to survive the play here, perhaps because she does acknowledge that light, because she's more realistic than Blanche is, who cannot face it. And Kowalski, name of Stella, her surname, now that she's married. Also, she's left Dubois and she's now Stella Kowalski. It's this idea of her as adapting to change and becoming part of Stanley's world now, Stanley's friends. And Stanley Kowalski, blue collar Polish name indicated there, linking to his immigrating, his history with immigration. His name, Stanley, the Stan there comes from the word meaning stone. So this idea of harshness, firmness, perhaps coldness, stubbornness there as well. And this idea of his name really means stony meadow. So compared to an orchard, stony meadow would be like a clearing there, right? A harsher, more open place that would have no trees in it. So the opposite of an orchard. Mitch, or Harold Mitchell, is Stanley's friend. Again, a very common name, which suggests his working class background, like with Stanley as well. But that nickname he's referred to throughout seems to make him more sympathetic, friendly, slightly more approachable here. And then Eunice Hubble, interesting because Eunice translates to victory. So this idea that she does survive the play because she knows that life has to keep going on. You have to keep going. Don't ever look back. Those ideas. You can't ever believe it, etc. And she's the upstairs neighbor who has become, in a way, an older Stella, right? Who is the older version of Stella, and we can see perhaps who Stella is going to be in the future there. With this dramatis personae, of course, some of these characters you will know very well, and you may be looking at the other characters and thinking, oh no. But these characters, even Eunice, will not be the focus of a full essay for you for an exam. But they are helpful characters to think about, adding complexity, adding nuance for your writing. So Eunice being linked to an ideas with Stella, or to the end of the play. The same with Steve was in the poker group with Pablo as well. You can add ideas from their depiction there as well to complement the understandings about Stanley. For example, the fact that he's able almost to throw two of them off who are holding him, which shows his absolute outsized masculinity and power, even compared to the others in the social circle in which he is. The doctor and the matron are only there in scene 11, but the matron does present a different form of femininity and also does struggle with Blanche. And it is as a result of the doctor and to the doctor that Blanche says, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. So this idea that she is now going to be depending on him, but this kindness being perhaps a bit euphemistic as well. And then the Mexican woman who's the vendor selling flowers for the dead, who scares Blanche, thinking about her perhaps as, again, foreshadowing Blanche's destruction, and the young man being another version of Mitch and Alan Gray, and the 17-year-old boy who she's trying to seduce in order to stay young and to relive her past. And let's get into our characters, shall we, and talk a little bit about them. So these are some key quotations for these characters that are very much important when we think about what ideas we can talk about for these characters. So again, helpful to have the workbook out in front of you as we work through this. For example, talking about her appearance, this is the initial stage directions, is incongruous to this setting. Something about her uncertain manner, as well as her white clothes, that suggests a moth. So here she doesn't fit in She's associated with white. She's associated with uncertainty compared to Stanley's confidence. And also as a moth. Moth linked with whiteness, linked with darkness, but also linked with being drawn to light. If light is truth, if light is reality, then for a moth, it's destructive, it's destroying, it's flame, but it's also inevitable, right? Moths continuously try and go towards a light. So it suggests Blanche's doom from the beginning. She also says, they told me to take a streetcar named Desire, then transfer to one called Cemeteries and ride 6 blocks and get off at Elysian Fields. This is her trajectory from sex to death and her inescapable history that has doomed her, even perhaps her inescapable family history that has doomed her to destruction because she cannot escape it. She cannot escape her past. Blanche also says to Stanley, can you believe that I was once considered attractive? This idea of flirtation, she wants Stanley to compliment her in an attempt to control the situation, to have power over him because of her beauty. He does not respond. It's a failed encounter. He says, your looks are okay. It's this idea that he is not going to allow her any power here. He is going to retain the power here. And this thus shows her lost beauty and her lost power, as well as the futility of trying to get what she wants out of Stanley because he is not allowing her any power. With Blanche as well, she said, our improvident grandfathers and father and uncles and brothers exchanged the land for their epic fornications. So this means that her male ancestors exchanged land and used up their money and resources to seek and pay off illicit pleasures, so particularly with affairs, it's suggested, or some kind of sexual history here. And that she is forced to pay for it as well because she has lost her home. So she is forced to suffer the consequences of this. But this also speaks to who she is. This is almost hereditary, isn't it? Just like the ideas of the Old South. Gentility and putting on airs, but also this idea of secret taboo pleasure. And links desire to death and loss here. It seems like she's punished worse than her male ancestors, but perhaps that's a commentary on her gender, that she suffers more for that reason. Blanche also says in Confrontation, I don't want realism. I want magic. Yes, yes, magic. I try to give that to people. I misrepresent things to them. I don't tell the truth. I tell what ought to be the truth. Don't turn the light on. So again, idealization versus realism. She's attempting to control the narrative, control truth, and even control the truth as it comes to this idea of light, right? That's what the paper lantern is about. It's her attempts to mask, hide, dim reality, control it. She wants escape, fantasy, romance. To her, that is preferable to the harsh realities and having to accept the future or even the present. But to us, and even to Mitch, it seems silly, impossible, and completely futile as an attempt. It just seems dishonest, unnecessary. So there we see again, she wants something that she can't have, but she becomes deceitful in order to get it. And then, of course, here, again, one of the most famous lines, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. Here, she is talking to the doctor in scene 11. She thinks she's going to see Shep Huntley, who is a previous beau of hers. Interesting because the kindness is that desire or sex here. The kindness of strangers. She sought out intimacies with strangers as well, right? As a way to fill the gap left by her husband, her lost love, her tragic history, etc., in order to escape from all of that. This idea that the kindness then is not real kindness, that is not what she's being given. She is expected to receive something as a result of sex. But with Stella as well, we can see that sex for them is an escape, is pleasurable, is a way to deal with reality. And this dependence has got her here. Her depending on sexuality on strangers, on how she can manipulate strangers to get what she wants out of them, has got her here. The here in blue are a lot of quotations. I can move myself a little bit out of the way so you can see them. Here talking particularly about major ideas with Blanche. So here, Vlasopoulos says, Blanche is very much in control of Stanley as she relates the history of Belrev, one he cannot hope to encompass as a comprehensible text. So here, this is when she's in control, is when they're talking about the past. And she would have been in control in their past as well. But because Belrev is lost, she has also lost this control. Vlasopoulos also says Blanche's southern accent and plantation origins mark her inescapably for victimization, given the turns taken by American history. In her account of the loss of Belrev, Blanche sets herself up as the besieged antagonist of the Grim Reaper, who had put up his tent on the doorstep. So this idea that she is fighting off death when trying to save Belrev, but that this is inevitable. Vlasopoulos also says that throughout the play, Blanche's displacement isolates her. So this idea of isolation, again, considered as a theme here. Kuntz says that all of Blanche's deceptions and escapes, along with the intensity with which they are constantly executed, can only give the spectator the impression of one who is hunted and violently trying to flee from a trap. S.H. Vlasopoulos is a critic that has written extensively about A Streetcar Named Desire, and particularly Blanche and sexuality. The same with all of these are the surnames of critics. So this idea of that her trying to flee from a trap, she says this in scene 10, that she's caught in a trap in desperate circumstances. You're welcome. At the same time, the very shallowness and absurdity of these deceptions carry with them a portrayal of the uselessness of it all. One can so easily see through Blanche that one becomes convinced she does not have a chance to save herself. So the futility of her lying, her deception, her attempts to escape are actually indicated through the desperateness of them. And Foster says the sun, like a searchlight, too easily penetrates her facade of self-control and discloses the naked truth, that naked light bulb of guilt and loss that she spends her life alternately obsessing about and trying to avoid. And let's think about Stella as well. So Stella, I was sort of thrilled by it. This is thrilled by Stanley running around smashing all the light bulbs with her slipper. She's attracted to his violence, his sexuality. She enjoys his masculinity here. In a way, she is not bothered and horrified with it in the same way that Blanche is. She likes it, which suggests that this sexuality, this masculinity, this dominance is an important part of her relationship with her husband. She says to Blanche, I'm not in anything I want to get out of. So here saying that she leaves Belrev, she's made her choice, she stays with Stanley. Even in this moment, we can see who she's going to choose when push comes to shove, right? She chooses desire over all, so we can see that she's going to give up Blanche over Stanley. She says she nearly goes wild. So this idea that she is also this sexual being, and she is dependent on Stanley for that as well. Stella, though, also tries to defend her sister. She is a conduit between the two of them because she's a conduit between these two roles and two places, two versions of the South. You didn't know Blanche as a girl. Nobody was tender and trusting as she was. But people like you abused her and forced her to change. So interesting that she can see this here, but she can't see it later, because this foreshadows the rape, and that the rape causes this change in Blanche here as well, and that Blanche actually is a sympathetic character to Stella, and she does attempt to defend her sister, but also speaks to the vulnerability of Blanche as well, and the fact that her circumstances has forced her to change. With this as well, Stella says, this is my house and I'll talk as much as I want to. So here, capturing those early ideas of second wave feminism, standing up to Stanley, defending herself, speaking out as a more empowered modern woman here. So this is her being caught somewhere between Blanche and Eunice Hubble. But of course, when she says this, and when she is talking too loudly and being defiant to Stanley, she is abused. So this is in the poker night scene where after this he does hit her. So this idea that she is punished for it, for defying her expectations in the patriarchal system in which she lives, but she then submits to them again. In the final scene as well, Eunice descends to Stella and places the child in her arms. It is wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Stella accepts the child sobbingly. So this is the baby in the end when she is crying about Blanche being taken away. Here, and she says it's this role of the next generation. It's submission. The baby comes down to her. It's in a blue blanket, so we can assume in this play from 1947 that it is a boy, and this idea that she is now responsible for this next generation. This is Stanley's son here, and that she's submitting to this role as mother and wife because that's what women at the time have to do, and that she doesn't really have any other option, does she? Despite her speaking up to Stanley at certain points, overwhelmingly she does have limitations in society that mean that she can't survive on her own at this point. And this is clear as well when Stella says, I couldn't believe her story and go on living with Stanley. That's not to say she doesn't believe Blanche's story. It's just that she can't accept it. So this idea then of denial, of fantasy, she betrays Blanche because she doesn't believe her version of events in a way in which she would leave her husband because he's raped her sister. It sounds like she's deluding herself, right? That she is, in a way, almost becoming Blanche-like because she is accepting that she can't accept it, that it didn't happen, over accepting the reality of, hey, probably Stanley raped Blanche and that she has to live with that and that he's going to get away with it. So there's denial, fantasy, but then we also have to think, yes, this is a betrayal of Blanche, but does she have any other choice? Is there anywhere else she can go? Not really, no. Interestingly here as well, we've got some critics. Hovis saying Blanche is a woman of words, which we can tell. Stella is a woman of action. It's the action that defies a similar fate for Stella. So this idea that because she takes the action of submitting, of accepting, she is able to escape and Blanche is not. But Hovis also says Stella's passivity is real and Stanley takes advantage of it by intermittently bullying her and by virtually denying her a voice in the affairs of the home. So when they have the radio on when he doesn't want it, he throws it out the window, right? So she doesn't really have a voice in her society, even if she is sexually fulfilled and supposedly has a loving relationship. Grogan says that Stella is lowering herself to Stanley's poor moral standards, which normalize repeated acts of violence despite the tenderness of the moment that hints at Stanley's personal feelings of self-abasement, which is when he's kneeling, calling for her, and then kneeling down and she accepts him. And Stella's forgiveness, but these do recalibrate their marital balance. So that scene where she descends to return to him is fundamental to this play. You must speak about that and consider that, especially if you're thinking about Stella. Ahmed says Williams uses Blanche and Stella's dependence on men to expose and critique the treatment of women during the transition from the old to the new South. So this idea that despite it changing from a system of power that is embodied by Blanche to a system of power that's embodied by Stanley, how women fare in that situation actually doesn't change very much because women would be vulnerable to abuse in either. And we can see that through Stella, who is dehumanized, belittled by her sister, We can see how Blanche is treated as well. And then also Stella as this newer, modern woman also is subjected to violence, as is Eunice, our other woman here. Blackwell says that Stella Kowalski is superior in background and personal endowments to her mate, but she subordinates herself to his way of life because they have a satisfying sexual relationship. So this really being her motivation is sex being more important than class, than history, than past, etc. And Majdik saying Stella escaped her old life only to create almost an exact version of it. So a version still dominated by men and patriarchy. Remember those improvident grandfathers and that past. She is not escaping any oppression here in this new version. And Stauenhaus saying the fate that befalls Blanche doesn't befall Stella because she lowers herself to working class. So thus thinking of her as the survival of the fittest here, as a survivor. Then we have Stanley, and here we have him as the embodiment of masculinity here. Center of his life has been pleasure with women. So thus he is absolutely intrinsically linked to sexuality, not with weak indulgence dependency, but with the power and pride of the richly feathered male bird among hens. So performativity, masculinity, sex, dominance, control, power here. Even the color, we can see this richly feathered. We can see that's already introducing these ideas of his clothing being indicative of his power in society as well, especially juxtaposed to Blanche's white clothes. Stanley also says, when we first met, me and you thought I was common. How right you was, baby. I was common as columns. I pulled you down off them columns, and how you loved it, having them colored lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay until she showed here? So he brought her down to his level. He showed her a different life than the Old South, and this pulled you down pulled off that pedestal, pulled off that position of power and status in society, and that Stella loved it. Those colored lights, presumably the ones in their bedroom, the colored lights going is linked to them having sex. So this idea that, again, Stella has chosen sex over class here, and a big part of their relationship is sex, and that this has been disrupted by Blanche. Stanley also says, what do you think you two think you are? A pair of queens? Remember, Stanley is continuously linked to poker. So this idea of luck and fate here. Remember what Huey Long said, every man is a king, and I am the king around here, so don't forget it. This idea of violence here and total control with this king language here repeated again and again, and queens not being as powerful as this king figure. He is absolutely in control here. The reference to Huey Long, every man is a king. Huey Long was a left-wing populist who was critical of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which was during the Great Depression, and was called the most brilliant lawyer ever by President Taft. So basically this left-wing politician who was advocating for the rights of the working class, who later became governor of Louisiana, where they are. This idea of the empowerment and fight for the working class. But however, this is a little bit ironic as well, because Huey Long is trying to say that working class people have rights and should be treated as humans and should have power in society as well. And Stanley takes that to the extreme and says that means that I have unquestioning power in this, and you are my subjects here in this relationship, which highlights very much something about the unbalanced dynamic between men and women here. Stanley, again, one of the most famous lines of the play, this idea that he acknowledges and she denies their sexuality. There's predestined violence here. There's this idea that this was always going to be the culmination of this conflict, and that Stanley views this as both justified absolutely preordained and also as necessary in order to punish Blanche and regain his power and his way of life here. So this idea of destination, predestination, fate, etc., even blame here linked to Stanley's view of the fact that this has been coming from the beginning because they can't really exist in the same world. Same with this, when he seizes the paper lantern and tears it off the light bulb, violence, control, and destroying the illusions that started with the rape scene when he overpowers Blanche, and then there he strips away the final illusions here, and at the end he gets what he wants, this idea of sensuality here, comforting Stella as she cries, but he's won, right? He's got what he wants. He has his arm around her again, so he has control again. He's got what he wants. He's powerful again, but also this does to a certain extent seem a little bit comforting until we have this part here as well that does seem like, again, he is deriving pleasure from her even in this moment and perhaps trying to comfort her with sex here as well. But also, if we think about the opening of her blouse, the fact she's holding a baby, this idea of him returning to her expectations in this moment. She may be sad about her sister, but she still has to fulfill his needs and the needs of his son. Critics for Stanley. Hovis said that not only is her ejection from the house necessary to preserve his honor, but it's facilitated by the full disclosure of her recent illicit sexual behavior in Laurel. So he uses her past in order to help destroy her. Hovis also says the play ends with Blanche serving as the scapegoat for Stanley's sexual offense, thus preserving the social order that has not changed since the height of Victorianism in American and especially in the patrician South. So thinking about then the man always winning and always dominating here, and the woman being the scapegoat is actually not something that's changed. Blasopoulos says that whereas Blanche wants to write Stanley out of history by relegating him to the savage, distant part of prehistory, Stanley is not satisfied with a reductive reading of Blanche. He moves to inscribe, to author, not only her past, but her future. Notice we don't ever really have a fully confirmed truth about what happened in Laurel. We only have what Stanley says and what Blanche denies. But we know Blanche is a liar, so we don't know what the actual truth here is. And as such, we have him writing her past and also her future by deciding her future, by raping her, buying her a bus ticket, and eventually getting rid of her, leading her to her death. Blasopoulos also says, ultimately, Stanley's authority derives from the same sources which most of us are forced to acknowledge in one way or another all our lives. Physical violence, intimidation, and above all, economic domination. In the quest for authority, Stanley profits from staying within the parameters set for him by his sex and class, and Blanche loses because she fails to conform. Stanley is perceived as normal. That's chilling, isn't it? This idea that Stanley is actually a normal character here, and that Stanley benefits from his sex and class, whereas Blanche is punished doubly as a result of her fall from class and power, as well as from the fact that she was a sexually transgressive as a woman in society. If she were a man, this would be a very different story, right? And then Mitch, finally, we've got Mitch as a more minor character, but is often brought into questions about Blanche, saying particularly about a relationship between Mitch and Blanche, or about masculinity as well. And with Mitch, we have this kind of submissive antithesis to Stanley's dominance. Stanley is an alpha and Mitch here is a beta. He's continuously talking about his mother and what she tells him to do and what she wants. He's just portrayed as sensitive, as loving, as an example of non-hegemonic masculinity, and very similar in a way to Alan Gray. So that's perhaps why Blanche is attracted to him, because he is this kind of different version of masculinity. Mitch also says, I'm ashamed of the way I perspire. My shirt is sticking to me. So here, extremely different from the confident Stanley who strips off and doesn't care who's he doing it in front of. Whereas Mitch is vulnerable and then as a result, very easy to deceive. So very much ripe for Blanche's predation in that she's going to use him to get what she wants. Mitch also shown to be sympathetic, loving as well, drawing her slowly into his arms. You need somebody and I need somebody too. Could it be you and me, Blanche? So this idea, it seems quite romantic here, but it is this mutual idealization, isn't it? Where they both think of each other as having someone. Blanche wants another Alan Gray and protection and a rest, and Mitch wants, in a way, recreation of his mother, right? He wants this idealized Southern belle. He wants a Stella there. He wants a wife to go home to because he doesn't have that. Bye, Maeve. Thank you for joining us. And so here, with this, we have potentially hope for a new life for Blanche, that she will be able to adapt. Remember, we have to the point where we think that Mitch is going to propose to Blanche and they're going to get married. But of course, this is doomed because they both romanticize each other and because they're both lying to each other. And this becomes particularly clear because he's not able to accept her past. And this idea that as soon as he knows about her past, he tries to assault her, which shows immediately that he thinks that he's owed sex for the time spent with her, or that he should have sex from her because she is the whore in the Madonna whore dichotomy. He calls her not clean enough to bring in the house with my mother. So that idea of the Madonna whore dichotomy in a sentence there, right? She is the whore and his mother is that Madonna idealized figure. We think then of sex as transactional. So then when Blanche eventually says, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers, this is what we're thinking about. This is a kind of mini scene of what I'm sure took place in Blanche's past, of her leading men on to try and fulfill these expectations to get what she wants. But when it is revealed that she does have a past that's not this epitome of purity, the violence of the patriarchy is revealed. So even in a sympathetic character like Mitch, he still does try to rape her. He's unsuccessful, but he does, which shows that this is not just a Stanley idea. This is that the patriarchy, that men are violent sexually to women, particularly women who do not conform to the standards of society's expectations. Gilbert says his boyish fragility is clearly is opposed to Stanley's brutish strength. So we can think about this as talking about Mitch as an opposite to Stanley. Thompson says from the beginning of their relationship, Blanche attempts to elevate Mitch to the romanticized status of the idealized Alan Gray because he shares his softness and tenderness. So a recreation then, an idealization. She's just trying to be with Alan. She doesn't really want Mitch. Alnama says Mitch is the opposite of Stanley in almost every single trait. You could use this as part of a counter argument to show, okay, well, that may be true at the start, but underneath it's revealed that the violence of the patriarchy is ubiquitous. Lund says that Mitch and Blanche are prospective mutual saviors, but in fact, he is the real cause of Blanche's psychological downfall. Blanche sees a potential new husband in Mitch, and when she realizes that he knows about her troubled past, she mentally collapses. While Stanley's final act is certainly as cruel and devastating, Mitch's rejection of Blanche is essentially what sets off her final madness. So that part there, thinking about that as, again, an alternative perspective here, thinking about the reasons for Blanche's destruction. Is it Stanley? Is it fate? Is it inevitable? Or is it Mitch? That is an interesting idea there. Or if we think about Blanche more broadly as destroyed by the patriarchy or by modernity, we can add Mitch in there as well. Here are the major themes of Streetcar Named Desire. Have a look at what stands out to you here. If there are any that you are thinking of that stand out to you as missing from here, have a think. But often if one comes up to you as not in this list, think about if it actually aligns with some ideas from here, because oftentimes examiners know, of course, that there's a limited amount of themes in a play or in a piece of literature. So they'll use synonyms or reframe these same ideas with different language, but they're still reaching for the same ideas. So there are many times when we're thinking about, for example, class, but the question isn't how does Williams present class? They're thinking about class tensions or the past and present or change here. What are the changes that take place, for example? Or identity. What are the identities here? There are gender ones and there are class ones here predominantly. So we can still talk about class even if the phrasing is exactly the same. We just want to rework our arguments to make sure that we're actually answering the question. Okay? We want to make sure that we frame our arguments well so that they're specific and controlled, but also so that we respond to the question and use the information we have. And this is what the questions look like here. So what they want you to do in this question, take a look, is explore how Williams presents tension between the past and the present in A Streetcar Named Desire. Be sure to include reference to contextual factors and literary criticism. Okay? So what we're going to do is, because we are over 2 hours in now, we're going to have a little 10-minute break. And in that break, feel free to have a rest, a brain break, grab a snack, use the toilet, take a lap, grab a drink of water, whatever you like. But also feel free to start mind mapping your ideas during this break, because we're going to start by discussing your thoughts. Okay? And if you've been enjoying this session so far, please think about leaving us a review. I've just put the link in the chat because we love hearing about our sessions being helpful to students. So if you found this helpful, please feel free to give us a review. It'd be much appreciated so we can continue to offer these free sessions in advance of exams, so to help you. We can also, I can also point you to the link for the full A Streetcar Named Desire playlist on YouTube of all of the sessions that I've done for A Streetcar Named Desire across characters, context, themes, modern tragedy, etc. Covered all there. There are, I think, 10, 12 hour-and-a-half presentations there that help cover all of your different ideas. And we also have my resources, which are revision notes. I will give you those as well. And then if you'd like to sign up for any of our other exam masterclasses, we offer them for all of our different subjects that we offer. So not just English, but maths, further maths and sciences as well. The link to sign up there is as well. Let's take a break for about 10 minutes and please feel free to use those links to have a look at what else we offer, and we're going to come back in about 10 minutes with our ideas about the tensions between past and present as an exam question to review. Okay? See you in about 10 minutes. Bye for now. Hello, everyone. Are we ready to get started again? Wonderful. Okay. So we are now going to think about essay planning and what this looks like for a real and very typically worded type of essay question. So let's think about this in this way and do some mind mapping together. Because we want to think, how does tension between past and present, how are they presented in the play? So let's think, how can we do this? Well, let's think about what the past and present represent. With the past, we of course have Blanche as the past. We have her as linked to nostalgia, the Old South, lost power, linked with virginity, linked with whiteness, linked with fantasy, linked with Belle Reve, linked with death. Right, we've got loads and loads of ideas, starting with the idea of Blanche as the past, right? Then we've got the opposite of this. We've got the present with Stanley. We've got the present here with Stanley. Is the present and is modernity. Apologies, my pen is acting up a little bit. There we are. And this is, okay, there we go. Apologies, everyone. My pen is acting up just a little bit. Is linked to the present. And as such, he's linked to reality. He's linked to bright light. He's linked to modernity. He's linked to color, jazz, noise. His immigrant background. So there are loads of ideas linked with Stanley as well. And then, of course, we have the tension between them. So we can talk about the past, we can talk about the present, and then we can talk about the tension between them. Is the clash of two cultures here. And the clash of old and new South, two different ways of life. And it's inevitable that one will win, right? Because we can't have both really existing in the play. So it's evident, obviously, that the present will win here. So, of course, we have at the ending then Stanley as triumphant. And Blanche as defeated. And this seems inevitable because the past has to be relegated to the past. And the present does carry on. So it does seem inevitable. But then we can also look at Blanche's trajectory from the start to death and destruction. Seems inevitable, doesn't it? Or inevitable. Because we've got her from the start, going from desire to cemeteries to Elysian fields. With this tension between past and present, we've also got the rape scene as the climax. In these tensions, in which the winner is decided, supposedly. And in this as well, we've got the baby here being part of this present, because the baby is the present going into the future. Because it's the baby that also indicates the winner here, because the baby is a Kowalski, which means that Stanley's name is going to live on and Dubois will die, because Blanche's name will not be preserved through her lineage because she's been destroyed, and Stella has taken Stanley's name. So we have Kowalski winning over Dubois. And with considering the baby, we've also got Stella, right? Stella as the conduit between past and present, who tries to ease these tensions. But she does, of course, eventually submit to Stanley. And as a result, survives. That says survives behind me there. We can talk about Stanley's immigrant culture as its own idea. We can talk about light and dark here. We can talk about the attempts to prevent the past and the present tensions through Blanche's obfuscatory language, through the light, through the washing away, through the distance. We can talk about so many different bits here, but this is quite a good place to get us started. SH, absolutely, you could talk about it through settings as well. Absolutely, particularly through those initial stage directions and then the tension between Belle Reve and the presentation of Belle Reve and then the presentation of the apartment. Absolutely, absolutely. And before we get into looking at the essay plan, let's just think about what we need to achieve here. So these are the A-level assessment objectives for English literature. And for across the board, they are asking you for different exam boards to do really the same thing. So the language is very, very similar, if not identical. And what they are looking for in particular is nuance. They are looking for a strongly crafted argument that shows knowledge of the text and the characters, that is well written, that shows how meanings are shaped through choices that writers make, that consider characters as more than just characters in a story and settings as more than just settings in a story, but rather as ideas. So characters as ideas, settings as ideas, dynamics between characters as talking something about power and society, and meshing this terminology and context with your argument. The examiner's reports recently have described it's important to have your argument, your analysis, and your context well integrated, that you use, you use your subject terminology and your context and weave it into your argument, not just having them in the same paragraph, but having them actually actively connected. That repetition is not a good thing. Because if we're repeating ourselves, likely the second, third, or fourth time we're saying the same idea, it's going to not be phrased as well. Which is why it's important when we're thinking about planning essays to consider an element at a time for our paragraphs. So rather than talking about the tension between past and present, with Blanche and Stanley arguing in their dynamic between every single paragraph, we need to split it up and cover more ground with a narrower lens. Rather than, for example, saying that Blanche and Stanley are this tension for 4 paragraphs, we can talk about Blanche first as the past, Stanley as the present, and then how their tension between these two characterizations fail to resolve. And if you notice the language of the highest part of the mark scheme, so with AQA, it's band 5, it asks you to be perceptive and assured in engagement with the debate, in exploration of connections across literary texts. So what are the patterns here? Assuredness in the connection between context and historicist literary concept studies. So how does the context link here? You need to not just say that Blanche is the Old South, but what about the Old South? What are we trying to say about the Old South? Same with understanding of authorial methods. We need to understand that Tennessee Williams is making these choices of setting or character intentionally to give us a certain effect and understanding. We need a sophisticated argument. That's where we can come in with thinking about our lines of argument in a moment. And then the assured use of literary critical concepts and terminology and mature and impressive expression. So that means you need to know what you're talking about in terms of literary concepts, critics, effects, and be able to talk about them well and follow through your argument and be clear on what you're saying. It needs to be narrow enough to analyze and wide enough for nuance. And it's the same with EdXL, where your band 5 is asking you to be critical and evaluative. Clear typically is band 3. And relevant and controlled is band 4. So we need to go beyond just having control over our thoughts, but rather seeing what we're saying here in a really clear way. Because this asks you to have a critical evaluative argument, sustain textual examples, which means, again, a pattern here. Critical evaluation, so looking at what this actually means, what's the effect. Sophisticated understanding of the writer's craft. So what are you trying to say about what the writer is doing here? Evaluation and appreciation of the significance and influence of context. So understanding the relationship between the text and the context in which it's written. Sustained evaluation of different interpretations, which means you can't just point to a symbol, you can't just point to a critic. That's called feature spotting and is often cited in exam reports as a negative thing that students do. Instead, you need to focus on patterns you notice, ideas that build or change across the text, and why that might be. You need to be nuanced about that and present it in a way that suggests that you are aware that someone might have a different idea and perhaps addressing that with a counter argument. And you also need as well to do the same with critics, which is the newer idea here in the AO5, isn't it, of talking about literary critics. Again, not just plopping them into a paragraph and saying, well, look what they said, but choosing critics that actually apply to what you're saying. Yes, SH it is. So choosing critics that apply to what you're saying and then explaining how they either prove your point or why what they say is not good enough for your argument. So for example, for Othello, we always talk about Coleridge saying that Iago has motiveless malignity. So he doesn't have any motive and he's just evil. So if you're trying to argue that Iago actually does have a motive, you can use that and say, well, while Coleridge says this, we actually think that there is a motive to him. The same with Stanley. talking about him being the antagonist here, and rather in the critics that we've looked at, saying that he is actually trying to defend his household from being destroyed by the influence of Blanche. Yes, it is SH. AO5 is assessed for EdXL. And the same with Mitch, arguing whether you believe that it's actually Mitch who destroys Blanche or not is part of your engagement with criticism here. So you need to construct an essay through clear lines of argument. You need confidence in your subject material. You need nuanced analysis and evaluation of ideas. You need awareness and engagement with context and criticism. And you need critics that you don't just name drop, but support and add nuance to your point, then you incorporate into your argument, and you have to evaluate if their point is effective or not. Thank you, Halia, for putting the EdXL spec in there, if it is going to help you there. But obviously we're covering loads of different exam specs, so not for everyone, but there they are for you. So let's think about what contextual ideas. That's that AO3 that we need to include here about tensions between past and present. Feel free to put in the chat as well. We've got the Old South and the values there, right? We've got the New South and the ideas of industrialization, modernization, and urban migration there. We've got New Orleans as a setting that is contextually relevant because it's diverse, because it's got that dual history of new history and old history. We've got Tennessee Williams's own family and own biographical context in thinking about his repressed sexuality, his parents as in a mixed class marriage, and his mother as that faded Southern belle. We've got the second wave feminism that would be influencing the presentation, particularly of Stella, and the roles of masculinity and femininity changing. Apologies. Talking and writing at the same time. Feminism. And we've got class dynamics post Great Depression, post World War II. Post World War II. And of course, we've got ideas of the Southern Gothic, social realism, and modern tragedy. So as we get into this is what our essay will look like. The expectation as you're writing for roughly an hour and 7 to an hour and 15 minutes, depending on your exam and what specification you're doing, you have just over an hour to write. So it's the expectation, even if you're given a blank copy, is that you're not spending your time rifling through a blank copy of the text trying to find quotations, but that you are spending your first 10 to 15 minutes planning, and then you're writing from there. You really do need to have quite a lot ready to go in order to make your best use of that time. So you do want to start thinking about essay plans, especially if this is upcoming to your exams or your mocks. You want to make sure that you have planned out some ideas and that you have some parts that are covered covered, like the quotations that you know serve you, like the context that you know serves you, like the critics that you know serve you, and even the lines of argument that will serve you. It's expected that you write 4 to 5 paragraphs here. It's helpful to write them in order so that you show in even that does show your construction of an argument being controlled, is if you are setting out, not starting with the end and then zooming back to the beginning and then going to the middle and it all being rather unclear, but rather that you start in a clear and controlled way here, and that your ideas are clearly distinct from each other. So if we're considering what our essay might look like, this is really what we were thinking about when we were mind mapping, was Blanche embodying the moribund or the dying out values of the antebellum South, unable to survive in the present. That's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, Stanley representing the nascent, the new, growing values of a new and emerging American society. That's present. The tension between Blanche and Stanley reveals a tension between the dying old South and the emergence of a new social order, the new South. So really, past, present, tension between are our first 3 ideas. Then Stella acting as a conduit between these conflicting forces of past and present, but ultimately giving into the present because that allows her to survive in the New South. And then it's always helpful to think about the conclusion of the plays in your last paragraph, because that means that you can consider all of the work that you've done in your previous paragraphs and sum it up as the consequences then. So thinking about all of the ideas you've spoken about, then using that last paragraph to discuss the consequences, and particularly for A Streetcar Named Desire, those last 2 scenes of scene 10 and scene 11 that are so rich in their analytical space. It's also helpful for, I would say, your 4th or 5th paragraph, but particularly your 4th. So you've come up with your big argument, and then for a 4th paragraph, thinking about it as a kind of counter argument or a alternative interpretation, because that allows us to add a new perspective on the topic rather than continuing to repeat ourselves about this idea of Blanche and Stanley. We have quite a lot else we could cover. SH, if you were interested in talking about setting here, that would be the place to do it as well. It'd be really nice, rich paragraph there to supplement some of the ideas that you know you'd want to cover in an essay about past and present tensions. Of course, this is one version of what we could do for this topic, but of course it gives us loads of time to cover our bases with this topic. So what I've put together here is a model thesis statement, not on the question that I've given you, but rather on a related question. So you can see what a thesis statement looks like here without me taking your opportunity to write it yourself, because you'll be able to leave this class set up to be able to do so and to produce a piece of writing that is prepared and well researched as an example, and also some guidance for a thesis statement in the future. So a successful thesis statement will include a clear addressal of the question in our first line. You want to use the question itself to help answer your and focus your thesis statement. You want to explain how, for example, this question is about fate, how fate appears in the text through your argument. So this would be introducing extremely briefly what topics you're going to cover. So as it's clear through Stella, Stanley, and Blanche, just trajectories or tensions between them, you would say. Analysis of the consequences, effects, or links to this question. So we'd think about what is the effect of fate or the consequences of fate. Blanche is destroyed, Stanley wins in the end, and then linking this to context here as well. So why is Williams writing this way now? So that literally, why A Streetcar Named Desire, why in 1947? And then suggestion of the writer's intention, linking it to their own beliefs or to their identity, perhaps. So I'm going to read this and see if you can identify where these ideas take place. So, fate is a fundamental theme in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, as it is clear from the exposition that the characters' trajectories have been predetermined by their class, gender, and history, and that a force outside of their control drives them to their inevitable conclusion. Rather than merely replicate the conventions of Greek tragedy, Williams may use the theme of fate to highlight the role that class, history, and gender play on determining one's fate and the consequences of resisting their power, especially in the tumultuous society in which the values of the Old South and New South were forced to intersect. Perhaps Williams's own determinist views, as well as the zeitgeist of the post-war South, informed his critique of the tensions between conflicting systems of power in 1947 New Orleans. Hi, Mikhail. Thank you for joining us. So there, we can see our ideas here. Addressing the question here. Talking about how this appears. The fate is predetermined by class, gender, and history, and links them to their inevitable conclusion here. Then talking about conventions of Greek tragedy, but them not necessarily being the same as what Williams uses here to talk about these ideas as determining one's fate rather than external ideas of fate as such. And again, the consequences of resisting their power. That's alluding to Blanche again, isn't it? Especially in, and then here we've got some context. Not a huge amount. We're saving our good stuff for our body paragraphs, but we want to make sure that we're covering and introducing some of our ideas about the New and Old South. That foregrounds really nicely our knowledge there. And then talking about Williams's own views and the zeitgeist of the post-war South to capture these tensions. So saying in these last couple of sentences, sure, Blanche, Stanley, Stella are characters determined by their class, gender, and history, but that was also the case in post-war American South with the tensions between old and new. Right? Not a huge amount there in terms of difficulty or complexity, just giving us what we need to know. And it's helpful to think about the fact that when your examiner is looking at your piece of writing, you can earn points early on. You can earn points early on because you're showing the fact that your thesis statement is constructed well. And this isn't something you need to do immediately fresh on the day, because you can have a kind of structure for your thesis statements that allows you to hit these marks of what a good thesis statement looks like, whilst also not requiring you to reinvent the wheel every second or every time you write an essay. So blank is a fundamental theme, as it serves as how does that fundamental theme appear and what does it do in the play and how does it get to the conclusion. How does Williams use this? To talk about consequences, talk about links, talk about context here, or a little bit of writer's intention. And then after this, with Williams's presentation of fate, of class, of gender, etc., may be influenced by what? And you want this to be relatively specific and related to what you're actually saying. You don't want to be talking about class all the way through here and then suddenly saying how men and women had relationships in 1947. Those two don't go together. So you want to choose a piece of context that matches what you're talking about, or speak about the Old and New South generally, so you can talk about the different conflicting ideologies that cover ideas of class and gender altogether. And then the play may serve a more didactic or more instructive purpose, as Williams seeks to, and this is your writer's intention here. So you want to consider, what is he aiming to do here in his presentation of A Streetcar Named Desire? And you can tie in ideas of that you know about Williams, as well as your suggestion for what he's trying to do here. This is a model paragraph I've put together for you to show you what this looks like for real. Okay, so I'm just going to shrink myself really tiny here. So you can see this model paragraph here. And in blue, just below me, I have put the ideas that I wanted to include. So I often find this is a really helpful way to essay plan, is to put what you want to talk about. Not just the quotations, the way you might do for GCSE, but talking about the patterns you're noticing. The streetcar as a symbol, the white imagery, light and dark imagery, the symbol of the lantern, the semantic field of death in the description of Belle Reve, the music, the locomotive and Blanche's reaction, these different ideas here that are linked but appear multiple times, and the clothing, as well as here, relevant criticism. So this is what essay plans look like at A level, is that you are organizing not just individual quotes, but patterns, okay? And this is what they look like actually written up. This is our first idea, our first body paragraph after that thesis statement that we would have written out. And I can give you an example here. So I'm going to read, and what I want you to do is just put into the chat, what can you borrow from that? What ideas do you want to use, perhaps using these ideas in your own paragraphs, not word for word, because that would be taking my ideas, but using them as inspiration for yourself. If you hadn't considered that idea, that interpretation, that way of writing before, you can also use my ideas to make sentence starters for yourself so that you can try and write in a different way. So I'm going to read and just allow yourself to think about what it is I'm doing here and how you can make this part of your work and level up to the next step. So, Williams presents Blanche as the embodiment of the moribund values of the antebellum South, as her Southern belle status both indicates her power in a previously rigid society which has now capitulated to modernity and progress. Williams may have presented Blanche like this in order to reflect the nostalgia for the Old South that was felt long after the Civil War ended, as well as to critique the desperate attempts of the old Southern elite to maintain their societal power. This image of a glamorous past is introduced in the initial stage directions, as the houses in Elysian Fields are described as faded white, dim white, and white frame weathered grey, and as having an atmosphere of decay. Thus, before Blanche's character is even introduced, both previous beauty as well as decay and deterioration are foregrounded. Blanche becomes a dreamy and faded embodiment of the Old South, in which the post-war zeitgeist was a nostalgic and outdated image superseded by the bright colours and omnipresent noise of the modern New South. This is coupled with Blanche's own description, as she's described as wearing white clothes and pearls as if she was arriving at a summer tea. Clearly, these clothes are unnecessary and even inappropriate in Elysian Fields and make her instantly incongruous to her surroundings when juxtaposed with the other characters roughly dressed in denim work clothes. Blanche no longer has access to summer teas or the power they suggest, and thus enters Elysian Fields as a kind of subaltern whose loss of power immediately marks her as a victim. Blanche's physical characterization marks her as a relic of the past, as well as ostensibly unable to adapt to the expectations, however superficial, of the new era, and thus as unequipped to survive in it. Her description as suggestive of a moth also carries symbolic weight, as it highlights her fragility and vulnerability as well as her destructive relationship with light. Her attempts to avoid and simultaneously irresistible attraction to light reinforces the tension between her past desire and her dismal present circumstances. As critic Foster describes, this light too easily penetrates her facade and discloses the naked truth of guilt and loss. Thus, if light is seen as an agent of truth, Blanche's moth-like attempts to avoid it suggest a lack of acceptance of what she has lost through the changes in society. Blanche's denial deepens across the course of the play as she attempts to mask and hide the truth with obfuscatory language, deception, perfume, and even with the symbolic paper lantern that attempts to hide the vulgar light in Stanley's apartment. The leitmotif's significance may suggest that Blanche uses the illusion of half-light and darkness in order to deceive herself and others from the reality of her unalterable fate and to try to recreate, however unsuccessfully, the glamour of the past. The paper lantern is linked with Blanche's vulnerability to modernity, as its fragility and temporality are too easily revealed by Mitch and Stanley tearing it off, thus indicating that Blanche's attempt to regain power are futile. Blanche's increasing powerlessness is established by the symbolism of her journey from the streetcar Desire to cemeteries and then to Elysian fields, suggests that Blanche's attempts to obscure or avoid the inevitable drive to the present are futile. Similarly, the white clothes increasingly become scuffed and crumpled, which suggest, in addition to her character named Blanche, a proclivity to inscription and soiling, as Stanley and the developments of the New South determine her future for her. Despite this, Blanche attempts to resist the inevitable, as critic Vlasopoulos describes her as the antagonist of the Grim Reaper, whose headquarters were Belle Reve. The semantic fields of death and conflict in the description of Belle Reve's sacrifice and Blanche as having fought and bled for it prefigure Blanche's own defeat and retreat to the family cemetery and as a sacrifice like Belle Reve for the sake of progress. At the end, Blanche is entirely powerless as her fingernails are set to be trimmed by the matron, and thus she will be metaphorically declawed and thus entirely powerless. Motifs of the Vesuviana polka are continuously linked to Blanche's trajectory as they serve as a haunting reminder of this inescapable past and Blanche's powerless attempts to return to it. This music fades in and out in direct contrast to the almost overwhelming noises of the modern locomotive that Blanche claps her hands to her ears in an attempt to shut out. As indicated in the rape scene, however, it is the drums and hot trumpet that win out over the wistful strains of polka, and it is Stanley and the present that dominate over Blanche and the past. Similarly, the love letters yellowing with antiquity, the scuffed silver slippers, and the crumpled white satin evening gown all appear fragile, soiled, and vulnerable to the inscription of Stanley as he is able to snatch and rip them from her. Her language, especially describing Stanley, reveals the deeply embedded prejudices of the Old South elite, as she describes Stanley as bestial, ape-like, and subhuman. Perhaps again this is a failed attempt to reclaim a lost power over a previously submissive group. However, this attempt to reclaim power only results in escalating violence from Stanley, which suggests that the systems of power in the past have been permanently dismantled in the New South. Thus, Blanche's lack of control of language reveals a deeper and more final loss of her power, as indicated by her permanent return to the past in her final delusions. Thus, Williams may use Blanche's characterization in order to reflect the inevitable and complete collapse of the Old South in the face of modernity. So what's good about this? We've got a clear argument and clear focus. Blanche and the past. We've got a load of language analysis, but talking not just about one quotation, but about the patterns of the paper lantern, semantic fields, the polka across, and its contrast with the modern language. The clothes from the beginning, then becoming crumpled later on and scuffed, and linking these with the letters. And thinking about these as linked to the Old South and the attempts to regain it, as well as thinking about the critics and engaging with Vlasopoulos, with Foster there in our analysis, and also even thinking about Blanche, the complex character, because though she does seem vulnerable quite a lot here in the past, it's also capturing her prejudices as part of the old past, and definitely capturing Williams's intention in using Blanche as an idea here. So we've got a load that we have done here. We can do the same for other arguments. So here we've got Stanley and the present. And here, the evidence we want to include, and here, the quotations that we want to include here. So what stands out to us? The denim work clothes, the roughly dressed, the Polish as linked to the Irish and not so highbrow. That's that prejudice language, but also the immigrant status here. The fact that Stanley, who is somewhat a victim of prejudice, has also made something of himself by becoming highly ranked in a specifically trained part of the service. Stanley as well saying, I'm afraid I'll strike you as the unrefined type and never a good English student, but thinking about this not mattering so much in this new version of society, and him being realistic and thinking, and we can see this swindled, this sort of savvy, realistic drive of Stanley that's protecting himself from the manipulation or the trickery of the upper class that previously in previous generations would have taken advantage of the working class. This is the new emergent working class society that is advocating for rights, remember, like Huey Long, and talking about power all of a sudden here. As well as Blanche saying, this is not the type that goes for jasmine perfume, so for luxury. But maybe he's what we need to mix our blood with now that we've lost Belle Rev. So the idea of self-preservation, of survival, that Stanley is the consummate survivor, and that even Blanche recognizes that he is going to survive this, and in order to do so, one has to associate with him. Halia, because of the break, and perhaps we'll go over a little bit as well, over to probably about 20 past, if that makes sense. We can see this as well in Stanley's resistance and the change between the two types of etiquette here, that Stanley embodies a new kind of etiquette that is not going to defer to the upper class here. Abioduko, if you want to, you can return to the beginning because we're almost 3 hours into our session now. So it will be helpful if you start from the beginning because we've set up for quite a while now here. Stanley, again, defending himself and his identity, resisting the prejudice of an outdated system and rewriting his own story here and his identity and being proud of it here. This is part of this new class and new system of people who are able to speak for themselves. And talking about the baby, it's going to be all right after she goes. So this idea of the present being able to thrive once we've cast off these issues with the past. Stanley saying it's a red letter night for both of us. That means success. That means celebration. Interesting that he says it this way because that associates him once again with red. And two versions of the American dream. Having an oil millionaire and having a baby. So Stanley making it in America because he is working class and wasn't a good student, but he still manages to ascend the ranks in the army, to have a good job, to become a king the way that Huey Long says he should, to be 100% American, and to have a baby in America, which is being able to continue his name in America and start his own descendancy, of which he is the founder of his own line and family line. Stanley also says, I've been on to you from the start. Not once did you pull any wool over this boy's eyes. You come in here and sprinkle the place with powder and spray perfume and cover the light bulb with a paper lantern, and lo and behold, the place is turned into Egypt, and you, the Queen of the Nile. So this idea that this would be the past, and she's saying no. and relegating Blanche to the deep past, right? To Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And he's saying no. He can see what she's doing, and he is not going to allow her to claim power over him, even with something so small as a paper lantern and what that symbolizes. And Stanley having the final word at the end in his conflict with Blanche, because he says, you left nothing here but spilt talcum and old empty perfume bottles, unless it's the paper lantern you want to take with you. You want the lantern? And he crosses to the dressing table, seizes the paper lantern, tearing it off the light bulb, extending it towards her. She cries out as if the lantern was herself. So here, really, the language of sight, the symbol of the paper lantern being torn off, is the return to reality, the stripping of illusions, and the forcing of Stanley's way of life, Stanley's view of things. There is Stanley's clothing that's indicative of his class, the semantic field of dominance and sexuality, the meat-throwing euphemism that we couldn't include here, but we could also include in our analysis, the monosyllabic direct language that's so much in contrast to Blanche's, the accusatory tone built so frequently in dynamics between him and Blanche, the use of repetition, forcefulness and emphasis, this idea of American language, 100% American, Huey Long, the details of his Polish ancestry, the characternym of particularly of his surname, the language of sight, the symbol of the lantern, as I said, the symbol of the baby, and the semantic field of violence in Stanley's movements here as well, and a couple of quotes as well from critics that give us more here about how we can talk about Stanley in a paragraph. This is how we can start it as well, is Williams presents Stanley Kowalski as representative of the nascent values of a new and emerging American society, which established itself in the post-war period. Through Stanley's characterization, Williams may be attempting to highlight the changing world of the New South, which was defined by forces of immigration, urban migration, and working-class society, whilst also revealing its dark underbelly of violence, brutality, and misogyny. As shown by Stanley's powerful dominance across the play, in the New South, immigrant status and a working-class background did not necessarily condemn one to social submission. Stanley is initially crafted as, and then we can go from there. There are loads of different sentence starters that, with tweaks where you remove Stanley from the words, you can use in your paragraphs more broadly, so that this can help support you in challenging your writing if you haven't used phrases before, like reflecting the contemporary view. A motif or semantic field is constructed to. This evokes an image of. These are all very helpful. And then here, with writer's intention and talking about critics here and building in this idea of patterns, and patterns with not only language device but also structure and the entire text. So there's a load we can do there as well with our argument. And here, this is our idea 3. Again, we've got lots to talk about. We can return to some of these ideas of the tension, people not being able to find common ground, Blanche trying to elicit a response from Stanley, him not giving her that. That is the tension. Again, the Louisiana Napoleonic Code, this idea of him trying to confront her. She thinks she can get rid of this or dissolve this argument by flirting with him. Look at the violence in his response. He's not interested in it. Interesting with this, the atomizer, the perfume. It's almost like she's trying to cast an illusion here, or trying to distract him, and he doesn't do that. So he is then in control there. This is also clear in their language. Here, her verbosity and use of qualifiers and obfuscatory language compared to his direct, almost monosyllabic language. The juxtaposition between them across. Again, this idea of jasmine perfume versus mixing our blood. Here, work clothes versus summer tea clothes. There is a load of tension there between the two. We've got the bestial language here with the prejudice of Blanche and the clash here that's later confronted here. Violently as well when he is being questioned, when we can see who is starting to emerge in this conflict. The violence in the stage direction there. Of course, again, we've got the Huey Long illusion. We've got the use of prejudiced language and Stanley's reaction. This derogatory language here, and even dehumanization, where he is able to define and redefine his own identity rather than submit to that of the upper class's prejudice. This idea of them as symbolic, as characters more broadly, and the semantic field of destiny here, the tension between illusion and reality, which can be them as well. Even this, the sitting on your throne and swilling down my liquor, there, the juxtaposition and tension between who is in power there. And again, the final winning of this, the tearing, the crying out. We've got critics as well to help cover this, but we've got a load to talk about with this as well. Stella, the same. Of course, we've got a lot to talk about here. This is again the meat, heaving the package here. He does this and she capitulates. She cries out in protest, but she catches it and then enjoys it. This is a euphemism, a sexual euphemism in particular, thinking about their dynamic and what's important in it, and him claiming her and controlling her. The fact that she had to adjust herself here, but also the idea that Stella is to a certain extent blind. There is an element of blindness to Stella here because she can't see what's in front of her. But also Stella is able to be a conduit between them because she understands that she has crossed to a different kind of society and calls him a different species here than the men they used to go out with. She also is much more aligned with modernity. She had to make her own living, something that Blanche has never had to do. She tries to explain Blanche to Stanley and tries to negotiate the conflict between them, as we can see here, and defends her sister. But when she tries to speak too much out against what Stanley wants, he corrects her with violence, and she may say she doesn't like it, but that doesn't mean that he stops. She starts to defend him as well. Blanche tries to tell her, don't hang back with the brutes, but we can see that's exactly what Stella does in Blanche's mind. But that, unbeknownst to Blanche, is actually what we are moving towards. Stella and Stanley are not hanging back, but rather moving forwards, and it's Blanche who's hanging back. Stanley as well, confronting this, you thought I was common as columns, but he pulled her down and she loved it. And she sacrificed all of that, all of her power for what she has with Stanley. We can see this in these extremely important quotations here when she literally physically descends down the stairs and returns to Stanley. When they come together and we can see what is important to them, he falls to his knees clearly in penitence. Her eyes go blind with tenderness, so clearly her love for Stanley blinds her to what happens later and to maybe the reality of her situation. And she raises him level with her, so she puts them back on the same level. So that means then, again, she's capitulated to him. And then even in their sex, he is violent there, or in the preamble to their sex, when he opens the door, lifts her off her feet, bears her to the dark flat. He's in control again. but she has submitted seemingly willingly. And then afterwards, we can see how she has capitulated. One hand on belly, so on the baby. The other hand dangles a book of coloured comics, so literally a comic book, as if she's a child, which suggests an infantilization here as well, that she has submitted completely to Stanley, even mentally, because she has, it's almost as if she's been drugged. She hasn't, of course, but it's as if the sex, the relationship with Stanley has blinded her and made her indifferent to other elements of society that maybe she should care about, and makes everything else unimportant to her. So that's that initial description, and then her silencing at the end. Before that, she is normalizing his behavior, making excuses for him now to Blanche rather than the other way around. And then, as we said when we spoke about this already, Stella choosing Stanley over Blanche, not being able to believe it. And then after that, she says, what have I done to my sister? But after that, she stops talking again. And really, we don't hear from her after that. She has the baby with her. She has Stanley with her. He starts to comfort her in a way that suggests sexual overtones. And he finishes with this language, and of course Steve has the last line, but Stella doesn't speak after that. It's as if she has been taken completely over by Stanley again. Again, we've got critics here for us. We've spoken about them already, so we've got them there for us to incorporate into this paragraph should we like. With this here, we've got the conclusion and looking at the predetermination of this conclusion. So the moth, the white clothes, desire, cemeteries, Elysian fields. What Blanche says, the first time I laid eyes on him, I thought to myself, that man is my executioner. That man will destroy me unless. That idea there of predetermined, predestined destruction. Stanley saying her future is mapped out for her there. So we've got the moth, we've got the clothes, the dark, lurid primary colours, and the white. We've got the symbolism of the trajectory. We've got the semantic field of destiny with her future is mapped out for her, as well as the discussion of astrological signs, the poker, this idea of luck and chance and fate there. This idea of Blanche being lost, and this lost being linked with sexuality and her improvident forefathers. We've got the flores para los muertos, which is flowers for the dead. And Blanche's reaction says, no, no, not yet, not yet. Again, we've got this quotation of Blanche being relegated to the absolute past, but this being a farce because she thinks that she can do these minor things and turn it into the past, and clearly she can't because Stanley will not let her. She describes herself as caught in a trap. Stanley says we've had this date from the beginning and seems to blame her for it. When she's talking about death in scene 11, we've returned to ideas of purity, death, dropped overboard, the chiming here, and returning to her first loves. This idea of returning to desire and death being linked, her insanity, and the bells chiming as being her time being up and her fate being rung. Again, this idea of you have to keep going. So not being able to be bogged down by Blanche's destruction, but rather having to carry on. Blanche saying, I'm only passing through, which is really indicative of her whole time in this play, is that she is passing through Elysian fields to her death. Passing through Stanley and Stella's life to her death. She's already on the trajectory. She's already on the streetcar. And again, it seems like the cycle is going to continue with the doctor, with her dependence on someone else, using what she thinks is her charm to be protected and depend on someone else. But of course, she thinks this is not what it is, which is going to her death in a mental institution, and then the future. So Stanley winning because Stanley has his child, his son in particular, accepted and as the final image of the play. And here a conclusion, again for fate and not for past tensions between past and present, so that we can have an opportunity, if we like, to write up this exam question ourselves. So really, I've prepared you by giving you all that you need to then try and write this out and give yourself a practice with some guidance here. You've got sentence starters, of course. You've got sentence starters for the thesis statement as well, quotations and guidance for each paragraph. And then this is an example of your conclusion, and we'll look at some sentence starters. Again, this is all in your workbook, which is accessible in the link of the description. So I'm going to read here for you. And this is what a conclusion will include: a return to the question. A return to the question asked, a brief summary of the arguments, again, just wrapping it up. This can be a couple of sentences. It doesn't need to be long. And then push them to their further conclusion. So make sure you get to the point of talking about how all of this leads to their destruction. And what happens here, Stanley wins, Blanche doesn't. So past loses and present wins, and then writer's intention and perhaps audience's reaction, considering the fact that we've got two different audiences at play here. So I'm going to read, think about how you can borrow from this, how you can model your own after this. If push comes to shove, finish your model paragraph rather than spending time on a conclusion, because a really well finished body paragraph is better and able to gain more points than a conclusion. But if you have those extra couple of minutes to do so, do try and wrap up. You can incorporate these into the final part of your final main paragraph if you feel that you only have 5 minutes left or something like that. So, in conclusion, fate serves as a fundamental theme across A Streetcar Named Desire, as it determines the trajectories of the characters and guarantees Blanche's inevitable destruction. By the end of the play, a new social order has been established, and Stanley's predetermined gender role, as well as his violence and brutality, guarantee that he will emerge triumphant. However, this audience's discomfort with this supposed triumph perhaps speaks to Williams's message about the nature of a society in which the vulnerable, transgressive, and weak are punished and ultimately destroyed for the sake of progress. Though Blanche's fate is inevitable, the audience is still shocked by the brutality and finality of her destruction. Her fate not only destroys Blanche, but also leaves Stanley, arguably the antagonist of the play, unpunished and even victorious at the end of the play, as he regains full control over his world and particularly over Stella. As Blanche embodies the moribund values of the Old South, notice that's language that we used in our paragraph, so we're summing up there again, that are violently discarded by Stanley's modern working class realism, it is clear that the fate of Williams's characters reveal a struggle between two conflicting ways of life, context, in which one's capitulation, exemplified through Stella's trajectory, is predetermined by both American history and the progressive values of the New South. Williams himself describes that it is out of regret for a South that no longer exists that I write of the forces that destroy it. Thus, the audience's qualified sympathy for Blanche at the end of the play is perhaps Williams's own attempt to eulogize a version of the South that necessarily was defeated by brutality and violence. Perhaps here, Williams's sympathetic construction of Blanche stems from the struggles of his own faded Southern belle mother, Edwina, as well as his own struggles to accept his inevitable rejection as a gay man in a deeply homophobic society. A contemporary post-war audience whose society was defined by rapid change may have seen their own society harshly reflected in Williams's New Orleans, as Stanley's characterization captures many of the oft-championed values of the post-war era, such as realism and working-class identity. In contrast, a modern audience may view the violence inherent to Blanche's destruction as a complex portrayal of a woman fated by the restrictions of social conventions as well as gender and sexual roles. So think about what you can borrow from that in terms of thinking about some ideas to prepare for a conclusion that you can do well. SH, do you get marked for a conclusion? You don't get marked for a conclusion as such, but you can gain points in terms of your construction of an argument if you're able to wrap up your essay in a way that's not in the middle of a sentence or that's not clearly missing something. So if you don't have time for a conclusion as such, if you don't do a conclusion, you don't have time for a conclusion, that's fine, but you want to leave your essay in a place where it feels finished, because that's part of getting points for the structure of your argument and the control of your argument. As you can see, this conclusion breaks down into only a couple of sentences. In conclusion, blank serves as a fundamental theme across A Streetcar Named Desire, as it serves as, by the conclusion of the play, what has happened. You can think about that in a different way with this not only destroys Blanche, but also does what else, so what are the other consequences? Perhaps here William seeks to highlight contemporary post-war audience versus a modern audience, and that's it. You can put this, if you combine these two ideas, here, you've got 3-4 sentences to finish up, which you, of course, will also do well to finish off a paragraph. So now, just for our final few moments, let's think about how the ideas we've talked about today could apply to many different topics here. So I'm just going to run through a couple of different essay questions, and we can think about how we can apply what we've learnt to different ideas. So here, this question is, explore how Williams presents the theme of fate in A Streetcar Named Desire. So I gave you a model thesis statement and a model conclusion for an essay on fate. But if you think about it, very similar ideas of tension between past and present and fate, because getting to the present and the defeat of the past all link here. So for an essay on fate, we could talk about Blanche being fated to death from the start by being linked to her ancestors, the moth, the past, and the Old South. Separately, in idea 2, we could think about Stanley as being destined to survive with the New South connection, his drive, the bright colors, the poker, his link to modernity, and good luck. In argument 3, we could think about Stanley being the force that destroys Blanche and has to in the inevitable clash between them. So a fated clash between what Blanche represents and what Stanley represents. So very similar to what we spoke about already. And then in argument 4, we could talk about Stella as able to change her fate through her submission or through her acceptance of modernity, and talking about her as survival of the fittest, so able to defy Blanche's fate. And then at the end, we could talk again about Blanche being destroyed, Stanley triumphing, and Stella either becoming self-deluded or accepting, and talking about the fate of the baby and hers being linked to the fate of the baby. So really a lot of ideas just reformulated into a different essay. Same with a question that asks you, explore how Williams presents class differences in A Streetcar Named Desire. There we could talk, as SH said, about the setting as indicative of class, even focusing on that initial presentation of New Orleans, faded white, atmosphere of decay, etc., and then contrasting that to the description of Belle Reve. We can talk about Blanche as the embodiment of upper class values, and Stanley as this new face of working class America. We can talk about working class women, so Stella and Eunice, as well as the upper class Blanche, all being dependent on men for stability. So despite their class, women of all different classes are dependent on men for stability and financial stability. We can talk about the prejudices of the upper class and the violence of the working class. We can talk about Stella being caught between these two. We could also talk about the upper class as being associated with death and being fated to the past here. We could talk about the rape scene even as this Marxist triumph of the working class, the proletariat, over the bourgeoisie as well. If we're thinking about Stanley as a character, we can think about different elements of Stanley and what he represents. So, of course, his working class identity, but also his masculinity, also his links with violence and what that reveals about the patriarchy, also his attempts to control his surroundings, him as the catalyst of the play and the figure who drives the action of the play. We can talk about him in an alternative interpretation as a Marxist hero who's threatened by Blanche and thus needs to destroy her. And we can talk about his ending as triumphant as well. And we can link Stella, of course, his passionate relationship with Stella and his sexuality being important. We can talk about him contrasted to Mitch as this dominant alpha character compared to Mitch's submissive beta character. We can talk about Stanley and color here, Stanley and noise, Stanley and music here as well in an alternative interpretation. We can also think of this as a tragedy. Explore how Williams presents Streetcar Named Desire as a tragedy. It's very common, particularly in EdXL, for there to be questions on stagecraft, so on lighting, on tragedy, on stage directions, on different choices of the narrators here. Oh, well, not of the narrators, of the playwright here. And so we could think about tragedy as Blanche as a tragic hero, her hamasha in argument 2, the external forces that act on her, of time, of past versus present, of violence, of patriarchy. We could talk about inevitability and her drive towards the conclusion. We can talk about the lack of catharsis at the end. We can talk about the Ibsen effect, or Stanley as the antagonist and not as fate as the antagonist as well. There's loads to talk about there as well. And then we can also talk about, and this is as I warned you, explore how Williams uses light in A Streetcar Named Desire. You might panic if you see this, but think about it. There's so much to talk about light. Don't just tell me about different times where there's light. Tell me instead about what light means. How is light presented? Light is presented, for example, as reality and scrutiny. The paper lantern is a symbol of attempting to escape and control a relationship with reality as fantasy and romanticism. We can talk about Blanche's attempts to hide from light and to avoid light because she hates the vulgarity of light because she doesn't like what it reveals. We can talk about the colored lights and bright colors as linked with sexuality and with Stanley. We can talk about what light reveals. So deceit, deception, fragility. Or we can talk about Stella and blindness here as well. And we can talk about the ending as that forcible exposure of illusion, unmasking, and even about darkness as linked with sexuality as well as the past. And we can talk about Stanley as the agent of light. There's so much to talk about with light as well. Do let me know if you have any questions at this point, because we're just getting to our end. We've been here and locked in for 3.5 hours at this point. So very well done to those of us who have been here. I did want to check if there are any questions. Just so you know, these ideas do apply to any exam board because we're not talking about these as exam board specific questions. We're just thinking about this as text revision. So if you were worried about that, don't worry. Please, will you, if you've got a moment, fill out a review for us for Trustpilot, because we have been working hard to be able to present you with ideas for and different revision topics for free, accessible on Eleanor Does English. So if you can give us the reviews that allow us to continue doing that, that would be very much appreciated. If you can like this video, comment, subscribe, etc., that would be very much appreciated as well, so we can continue to offer these things. As I said before, this is part of our exam masterclass series. So there are 2 more exam masterclasses with me on the 15th of May and the 29th of May from 3 to 6 p.m. again, or likely more till 6:30, on poetry to help prepare you for poetry regardless of exam board again. If you'd like to sign up for other subjects, there is a link coming to you again in the chat for sign-ups, as well as an entire playlist of A Streetcar Named Desire content on my channel as well. That's short form content as well as long form content. So an 1.5-hour videos looking at specific themes, specific characters, getting in much more detail as well about context, etc. And then finally, we've also got our My Resources link, which is our written as well as multimedia revision material that you also might find helpful. It gives critics, it gives arguments, it gives ideas about all of the different topics for A-level, all there for you. So thank you very much for your attention today. Very good luck on your revision and for any upcoming exams, and I hope to see you next time on our exam masterclass series, or every Wednesday from 6:50 to 8:20 on Wednesdays here on Eleanor Does English as well, because we will be getting into more free streams every Wednesday evening at that time. Currently, we're focusing on The Handmaid's Tale, and for June, we're going to be looking at more poetry as well. So do join us there. Thank you to my mods, to Halia, to Mavis, to Zakia for joining us as well. And thank you to everyone who contributed and who joined us as well. Really appreciate you. Tell your friends and see you next time. Bye for now.